morning, everyone, and welcome to our stakeholder workshop for draft extended day-ahead market tariff revisions. My name is Brenda Corona, here representing the Stakeholder Affairs Group, along with John Anders, who is our lead for this tariff revisions workshop series. Today, we will be discussing a few revisions on the next agenda, on agenda slide, but also we wanted to go over that we do have a panelist group of many legal representatives who will be presenting on different sections, so we will cover that on our agenda slide. This call will be recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you do experience any technical issues during the call, feel free to send me a Skype or send a Skype to my event producer, Silas, who will be able to mitigate any questions that you're having. But we do see a few folks that are joining in audio only, so that's a good sign that we can make sure if there's any questions, please press #2 on your device. And those who are majority are signed in through the WebEx, you will have to utilize the raise hand icon so we can make sure to unmute you at the time when we are, if you have a question. But also for asking a question, make sure to state your name and affiliation clearly, and that way we can make sure we address your comment. And if you're submitting a comment through the chat, please also submit the affiliation that you're representing so we could kind of route that within our group. At this time, we'll go over the agenda for today. We'll have the first hour or so, or 2 hours on revision walkthrough with the section 33. We will be taking a lunch break around noon. And then after that, we'll come back and continue on sections 29, 33, and 11. And then lastly, around 2:45, we will wrap up with next step and closing remarks. And at this time, I'll go ahead and invite John Anders to go ahead and kick things off for the workshop for today. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to submit them to chat, and we could start now. So John Anders, I do see you as presenter, and you're on mute, so go ahead.
Thanks, Brenda, and thanks everyone for joining us again today for the second of 3 scheduled tariff workshops. My video, I'm not sure what happened between here and there, but it is not working today. So I will carry on, and we'll go from here in any event. So I just, again, I do want to reiterate my thanks and our appreciation for everyone's, constructive input and feedback on the draft tariff materials that we published. We're really trying to engage with stakeholders in this process, and we do appreciate that and understand the volume of materials was considerable for both stakeholders to consider and also, on the flip side, on our side, to consider all of the comments that you've submitted. So what we have done is, since the last workshop on Monday, and based on stakeholder feedback, we did publish first we published an excerpt, sort of an addendum that was of some focus on Monday, and then we did publish sort of midweek, I think it was Wednesday, our working version of section 33. So we are continuing to work on these materials, both in response to your comments in these meetings and our own effort to improve the overall documents. Our goal in these workshops is to reflect everyone's input and to publish an improved and complete second round of the draft tariff, with the goal of publishing that, sometime the week of June 5th, sort of depending on our progress. And then starting back today, we're going to resume midway with section 33.30. So this is just sort of the beginning, if you will, the bidding and scheduling rules, and then the actual day-ahead market, and then the GHG are probably the three main topics remaining in Section 33, and then we'll carry on from there. And we'll probably not skip around too much, although, like we said last time, we will come back to Sections 33 and 11 after we've gotten through most of the substantive material. And I really want people to, ask questions. If your question, either in your original comments or that comes to your mind during these meetings, bring it up as we go through these sections so we can, do our best to capture everything and reflect it back in the next version of the tariff. And with that, I'd like to say I am joined by a number of my colleagues, both in the legal department and subject matter experts on the line here to try to answer questions and resolve any issues that come up. And today, like I said, we are going to be starting with Section 33.30, and so that includes David Zlotlow will be leading that, and Bill Weaver will be stepping in on convergence bidding in the midst of that. And then we're going to move to the resource efficiency evaluation, which will be Heather Curley, and then David Zlotlow again with some of the IFM RUC issues or sections. And then we go to Andrew Ulmer for sections 33-32. So that's kind of the lay of the land here, and we'll keep going until we work our way through, and then we'll see where we are at the end of section 33. Okay, well, thanks, and again, apologies for not having video today, but that's the way it goes. So David, it's all yours for now, and feel free to facilitate however you wish.
Okay. Good morning. I guess I'm not calling in from the office, so maybe that's why my video works. If you can see me, I can see me. Looks like video's on. But anyway, let me get the tariff document up, and we'll get going with section 33.30. So just Brenda, someone, can you confirm you can see the tariff document and you can hear me and everything's good to go?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so we'll start at the top of 33.30, and we'll just work our way down through the comments that we received. First up in section 33.30.1, LADWP asked a question, and Idaho Power asked a similar question, and I believe others asked the same question in other bits of 33.30. So I'll just sort of talk about it as a general a general issue. The draft tariff we put out referred to bids for ancillary services, and multiple parties asked, what does that mean if the whole construct for EDAM is that the EDAM entities will be self-providing ancillary services and that the market isn't going to be procuring ancillary services? Why do you keep talking about a bid for ancillary services? That's kind of confusing. And so the explanation for that is, I think what we'll do is we'll use the existing functionality to self-provide ancillary services. So in the ISO market today, you can bid for ancillary services as an economic bid, or you can self-provide ancillary services, which is just the term analogous to a self-schedule for energy. And so the functionality I think we would use for the EDAM entities to provide the AS rather than have it optimized through the market is to just submit a bid to self-provide ancillary services. And the existing definition of the term bid, capital B, is broad and covers both economic bids and self-schedules, or with ancillary services, self-provision. So that's the answer to that large topic. And then specifically to the question LADWP in Idaho had in 33.30.1. Okay, moving on then. So you see in section, let's see, next question, 33.30.5. There was a question from 6 cities in the startup and minimum load costs that the proxy startup costs and proxy minimum load costs will also include the market services charge and system operations charge as part of the what's included in those proxy costs. And that's analogous to the default energy bids in the ISO market today, that it includes a reflection. Someone tell me if I'm wrong. I'm virtually certain it includes some reflection of the grid management charges that would apply to the bids, and so it's just to fully capture an estimate of what the cost would be, because the whole point of the proxy cost is to reflect what a reasonable reflection of what the costs are. And so if the resource is going to face grid management charge or the equivalent for the EDM, these administrative charges, then it makes sense to reflect them there. And so that was the question there. That's the answer. And I'll stop for questions maybe after this next comment. We're already at convergence bidding. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions on that. And I think then we'll move on to convergence bidding as a separate issue altogether.
As a reminder, please use the raise hand icon below on the middle of the screen. But at this time, I don't see any questions, David. So thank you,
Okay.
Silas, for sending that. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Now, I'm sorry, Bill, were you going to take over on the convergence bidding section now? Did I remember that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to just scroll to keep it easier instead of unsharing?
Oh, that'd be great. Instead of switching.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think we received 2 comments on convergence bidding, which is known as virtual bidding everywhere else outside of the CAISO. The first comment was reasonable. It was about the 2-year transition period, saying that the final proposal had said this is the proposal, but we plan to start a subsequent stakeholder initiative that might identify a replacement policy, whereas the tariff provision seems like it's 2 years start stop, and then virtual bidding would commence. So this is kind of common in the policy process, but we can't put that kind of commitment into the tariff simply because it doesn't give FERC anything without knowing exactly what the replacement policy would be at the end of the 2 years. We don't have the rates, terms, and conditions to memorialize in the tariff. So, essentially, to put it another way, once we conclude the stakeholder proceeding to identify a replacement policy, we would still have to come in and amend this tariff provision anyway, regardless if it had identified that we were going to do something or not. We're still in the same place from a tariff perspective. So as it's the CAISO's practice not to memorialize those types of commitments in the tariff simply because we think FERC will balk at them and there's not a rate, term, and condition there of service. The only other comment we received on convergence bidding was a question about what the forecast referred to here. And here we're not referring to state estimate or anything. We're simply referring to the forecast that the VER has elected to provide pursuant to the tariff, which could be a CAISO forecast, could be a third-party forecast, could be its own forecast. So whatever it is, it's the difference there. So I'll pause here on any virtual bidding questions before turning it back over to David for the rest of bidding.
Silas, are there any questions in the audio online?
I see Alva's raised his hand from PG&E.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Alva, yeah.
Great, thanks. Actually, this is a question for David. I was hesitant to, because I'm a little confused about it, but on the AS, I just wanted to raise the question, maybe you can answer. Is there a conceptual difference between self-provision in the ISO, which is assumed to be self-provision for load-serving entities, and there's a mechanism for making sure that ancillary services that are self-scheduled are essentially counted towards load-serving entities' obligations, as I understand it. Maybe I'd like to be disabused if I'm just confused here, but I was trying to understand whether the situation is exactly the same for BAAs. Are they simply standing in for LSEs in terms of the self-provision construct. And then the other question I had was, what happens in real time? Is there any process for, I don't know what, and this goes to, I don't know enough about the WIM process now, but how does incremental ancillary service get procured for external to CAISO?
Right. Okay. I can give a tentative answer to both of those, and then if someone else from the ISO wants to chime in and say if I got it totally wrong or add some clarification. So I think the first question was, would the AS self-provision be flagged as going towards a specific EDAM entity's ancillary services in the same way, like you were saying that today, if it's self-provided, the resource can say this is to meet a certain LSE's or a certain, you say LSE's ancillary service obligation?
Well, I guess it's a certain SC's ancillary service obligation, the trade, the SC to SC trade, yeah. Right.
Regardless, I would assume yes. Someone can tell me if I'm wrong. I would assume yes, because that would be just part of tracking, if a EDAM entity says, we've determined our AS requirements are, X number of megawatts of spin and Y megawatts of non-spin, et cetera, we sort of need to track what's going where, what's going to meet which entity's obligation. So I would assume so. Someone else can tell me on the ISO side if I'm wrong. And then the second question, procuring incremental AS in the real time, again, someone tell me if I'm wrong, I would assume that the idea is the EDM entity is sort of showing up with its full requirement, it's saying here's our requirement and it's all self-provided, here it is. And that would be that would be that. So
there'd be
someone
incremental self-provision.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's how it would work. I don't believe there would be incremental procurement for the EM entities.
Incremental self-provision.
So it's not really incremental. This is George Angelides with the ISO. Just want to clarify. Since we don't optimize ancillary services for either EDAM entities or the EIM entities, we only do this for the ISO balancing authority area, where you have the concept of having incremental ancillary service procurement in the real time. When it comes to other BAAs in the market footprint, it's really a straight declaration of the ancillary service of provision of resources to meet the requirement, and that happens in the day ahead, and then in real time the same thing happens. So it's not incremental. You can consider that the self-provision in real time in EIM for an EDAM entity, it's simply overrides what was submitted in the day ahead. It's still the entire amount of the requirement that is targeted to be met.
Okay, and then that leads me to believe there's no way for CAISO, a market operator, to detect a deficiency of AS outside of CAISO. And so they'll just simply take whatever is self-provided as meeting the requirement, and that's that. It just simply blocks in resources that the BAA has declared are needed, and that's it.
Right. Now, in the EDAM RSC, there is a specific process that we check to make sure that the total amount of ancillary service of provision meets the ancillary service requirements for an EDAM entity. If it doesn't, they may fail the RSC. Yeah.
Right.
So that's for the EDAM RSC. Yeah. Great.
Thank you so much, George. That's very clear. Thank you.
You're welcome.
No more questions in queue.
Okay, thanks, David. I'll turn it back over to you for more bidding rules.
More bidding. Okay, so that was convergence bidding. We talked about ancillary services, and now we're rolling into section 30.8 bids from external resources. So these are resources from outside the EDAM area. There was a question from both Idaho Power and LAEWP talking about a self-schedule from an external resource into the EDAM area or into an EDAM entity balancing authority area. question was, would such self-schedules need to be specifically flagged as being for the purposes of serving load in the EDM entity BAA? And, you know, I think since two parties were asking it, there must have been something somewhere that suggested there would be that restriction. I know in looking this over, I wasn't sure, you know, what suggested there would be such a restriction. So, you know, my only answer for the moment would be no, and then this draft tariff doesn't reflect such a limitation. But if there was something that suggested we were going to put that on, you know, please speak up. Maybe we just sort of forgot about it or missed it somewhere in the tariff drafting. Okay, well, if anyone, you know, has something to say there, we'll go back to that, but I'll move on for now. So there was also a question on e-tagging requirements, that non-source specific e-tag requirements. So there's a sentence here saying the ISO will publish the EDM entity balancing authority area's quantity of import supply that doesn't have the day-ahead e-tag. I think there was a question, you know, what's the time frame of publishing? I think that is, you know, probably still to be determined. As you said there, it's for situational awareness. So, you know, I think we'll have to work that out, but I don't think it's sort of a critical factor in a you know, market process or whatnot. So, you know, we'll figure out what the right time frame is and you know, get that determined later. Okay, and so there was a section here, 33.3.8.4. It's showing a strikeout here. This is just a note that we considered that this material will be more appropriately in section 33.31.3.1. So you're seeing it here is struck out. It's not being deleted. It was just moved. And then we'll get to that when we proceed on to section 33.31. Okay, so then base schedules replaced by day-ahead schedules. So this section is talking about how EDM entities aren't submitting EIM base schedules because the whole concept of being an EDM supersedes the need of having a base schedule for the EIM. It's not applicable anymore. Bank has submitted, you know, in their comments, request the ISO provide the potential for a sub-balancing authority area implementation. And the answer is yes, it's still under consideration, but it's not something we can put in the tariff at this time because it's, you know, it's not really, it's not, there's no final determination there. We can't really, we put it in the tariff and that's sort of a commitment that yes, it's happening and we can't, we're not in a position to do that yet. So that is to be determined at a later time. Okay, then last bit of section 33.30, the information available for, I'll just fix that typo while we're at it, bidding by gas resources. There's been requests to get some clarity on the advisory gas results that will be provided. I think, you know, the idea that we'll need to publish advisory day +2 or day -2, and depending on how you're looking at it, market results to help resource scheduling coordinators have a better picture of what gas procurement they'll need to make. And so we'll publish the advisory results to help inform that. And the scheduling coordinator, as it says here, must request the information before 5 a.m. Of the day ahead market. Okay, so we'll pause there again for questions. Otherwise, we will then move into section 33.31, which is the you know, the core market section here of the whole EDAM, really.
We're not seeing any questions in the queue at this time.
Okay. Well, so 33.31 starts really, 2 sentences there, introduction, and then we go right into the EDAM resource sufficiency evaluation, which is, I believe, Heather, you're going to walk us through this, correct?
Yes. Hey, everyone.
Okay.
And so I'll get my screen
Heather,
share
just
set up.
real quick, because this is convergence bidding was a short section. Yeah, you should probably drive here because this is a longer bit, and I won't be able to keep up. So yeah, go ahead.
That sounds good. Hello, everyone. I am Heather Curley. I'm a senior counsel here at CAISO. I think I know a number of you from prior roles I've had in the industry, but I've been at CAISO now about 9 months. And I'll be leading us through the EDAM RSE as well as the EIM RSE when we get to section 29. Again, let me turn on my raise hand and chat feature. I encourage everyone to try to be as involved as possible. We're cognizant that the platform and the formal raising hands and getting unmuted can feel unwieldy, but we really do encourage comments on this section. Again, as John said, we're trying to get this right in a short amount of time. We did publish a red line version, which you saw, but of course we've done additional red lines since then. So as I go through my screen here, you may end up seeing 2 colors of red line. You should ignore that. They are all my red lines. They show up in different colors, but if you could just disregard that and give no significance to that, that would be great. So 33.31.1 is the EDAM RSE. Most of the edits you're going to see here are my edits added for clarity. We really didn't get a lot of stakeholder comments here. So if we didn't pick something up correctly or we missed it, just again, use the raise hand feature, use the chat, and let us know. But a lot of this is just clarification. So just cleaning up the language that through the EDAM RSE, the CAISO will test each balancing authority in the EDAM area. And then just to get familiar on terminology, there were a number of approaches we could have used, but we modeled the EIM approach. So a balancing authority area in the EDAM area, it is a mouthful, that includes all balancing authorities, including CAISO. If we are saying an EDAM entity balancing authority area, that does not include CAISO. But again, here at the beginning, we just wanted to be incredibly clear. So we added including the CAISO balancing authority. We're going to run those prior to the day ahead market, and the results are going to serve as the inputs, and we're going to complete our RSE before the IFM runs. So that's just kind of general language. I didn't really expect any comments on that, but let's get into the timing of the advisory and binding runs. We're going to produce advisory results at 6 and 9 a.m. On the day we run the day ahead market for the next trading day. The policy paper talked about additional advisory results being available on demand. Unfortunately, our technology team determined that would really just be an unwieldy process. We will be providing additional advisory results, but we're going to specify that in the BPM. At this stage, and I think most folks were made aware, we'll be providing those on the half hour. So 6:30, 7:30, 8:30. We're trying to see how many we can provide after 9, if we can provide more than the 9:30. So again, you'll see that in the BPM. As technology evolves, we may be even able to provide more advisory results. And so we didn't want to lock ourselves into the tariff on the advisory to allow us some room to expand, with the exception that we are committing in the tariff to provide the 6 and 9 a.m. results. Okay, any questions on timing? Okay, well, if you have some later, just raise your hand. Binding run is at 10 a.m. And we're going to make those available, our publication process and kind of the advisory and the binding and the different timing will all be set forth in the BPM, like I said, along with our details of when we'll be running those advisory results. Okay, components of the EDAM RSE. And again, this section may look like a lot of red lines. These are mostly my red lines for clarity. None of this is a change, but I did offer some comments here to explain what I did. So in our first draft, we had said supply bids, capital S, capital B. Supply, capital S, means only energy. So we realized we need to be a bit more detailed here. So we're considering all bids in the day ahead market eligible for participation, excluding virtual load and non-participation bids, as well as intertie transactions from unregistered resources. But the EDAM RSE will utilize all available ancillary service bids, the self-provision of ancillary service for the EDAM entities, as David discussed earlier, and the forecasted output of variable energy resources together with any demand response adjustments that are made pursuant to section 33.31.4.1. So that's really just kind of code for demand response. So that's the bucket that the EDAM will consider in each balancing authority for each hour of the day ahead time frame. We have some registration requirements, and we had some comments on the language we had previously about resources in the CAISO area, available, et cetera. That language was really about registration. And so we kind of moved and consolidated this language to clean it up so that EDAM resources and intertie resources that are registered with CAISO are eligible for the EDAM RSE upon satisfaction of the registration process that'll be set forth in the BPM. All internal resources in CAISO are eligible to be counted for the EDAM RSE without additional registration. And so I think both Idaho Power and NV Energy had kind of flagged our earlier sentence, wondering if that meant, that we were kind of attributing those to the CAISO RSE. That wasn't the intent of the sentence. Like I said, it was registration. And so the comment here just explains that. And for internal resources that will be used for others' RSE. So for example, if Idaho Power had an internal CAISO resource that Idaho Power would use for its RSE, that's where we'll use the transfer and transaction process. I want to flag for folks that it will be a process. Watch for additional training that we'll be having closer to deployment on how to do those transfers outside the CAISO and the transactions in an effective way. So Todd, I'm sorry, you probably put your hand up a little earlier and I'm just seeing it now, but can we go ahead and unmute Todd Ryan?
Hi, Todd Ryan from Pacific Gas and Electric. My understanding was that non-resource specific RA contracts would be eligible for RSE. And my question is, does the categorization of registered resources capture that subset?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right, Todd. The policy paper did talk a lot about contracted resources, and the way the CAISO systems are set up is, we don't have some sort of, flags for everyone's contracts of different types. So we're trying to capture that in, again, kind of the way the market is set up, but you are absolutely right that when we say they're registered consistent with the process in the BPM, we plan to add those details to the PPM to guide the registration process so that the eligible resources will be able to register and the non-eligible resources will not be able to register. And so happy to talk more about that, but I think you understand kind of that basic conundrum that, when we're running the day ahead market, we're not looking at contract status.
I'm sorry, I only had one cup of coffee this morning, so I'm not trying to be dense, but it's not clear to me that this is wording. What I'm reading here is only registered resources can count for the RSE, and I don't know how one registers a non-resource specific contract to meet that criteria.
I guess I'll say, George, do you have any thoughts on Todd's question? If not, Todd, we may just take it back to get the exact right language. Our intent was to capture it. Again, just recognizing the limitations that we have.
Yes. So this is George Angelidis with the SO. The distinction here is made between what we call system resources, that is a registered resource in the master file, and it can have the attribute that would indicate that it's eligible for RSE, and obviously all these resources that have an array capacity will be eligible for the RSE, as opposed to resources, intertie resources that are not registered in the master file, like intertie transactions. And because these are not registered in the master file, you cannot have the attribute that says they're eligible for RSE. And in any case, we have stated that these resources, these intertie transactions, they're pure energy, economy energy imports, and they won't be eligible for the RSE. So that's the distinction here between inter-trade transactions that are not registered in the master file, they're not eligible in the RSC, and system resources, which are inter-trade resources that are registered in the master file, and as part of the registry, they could have an attribute that would indicate that they're RSC eligible. That attribute will be set for RA resources and other resources that they have any kind of contractual arrangement to serve load in the BAA. Thank you.
So Todd, I think the takeaway is we tried to address it. If you feel these words don't address it, follow up with us to let us know some edits, or if you have them now, I'm happy to type them in. But I think George provided a bit more fulsome explanation than I was able to there.
I did not follow that at all. I will try again to read this offline and understand it better, but I want to make sure that what we're capturing here is that the full set of eligible resources are indeed eligible according to these words. So I will try again offline. Thanks.
Okay, well, I guess just real, Danny, do you think there's anything more you wanted to add before we move on?
Yeah, I was just going to say we can follow up with Todd offline. In this tariff process, we're just trying to show that we do intend to capture all eligible resources, and then we're trying to target the BPM of defining how mechanically we would do that. I think George threw out our initial plan, but to the extent we need to follow up Todd and make sure that meets your needs, we'll go ahead and do that.
Always appreciate it, Danny. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. If you have anything more, happy to take it now. And then I think just so everyone knows, once you go on mute, you're on mute for the next bit. So keep your line unmuted until your question's over. And so Todd, any follow-up, or should we close this one out for now for further discussion? Okay. And then this second, this kind of longer sentence here, it's really, I moved this, there was no edits to it, but we're just, again, as we say in the policy paper, when we run the RSE, we're going to reflect those registered resource characteristics and various limitations, but we don't enforce transmission constraints in the balancing authority. The result of the EDAM RSE is the quantity of upward sufficiency or downward sufficiency of each component for each hour in the day-ahead time horizon for each balancing authority in the EDAM area. And so now let's get into the requirements. What are those component requirements? So to perform the EDAM RSE, CAISO will use the following inputs when it performs its advisory and binding runs. The first will be the forecast requirement. So there will be three, just to preview, there will be three. The first of the three is forecast requirement. Demand forecast and variable energy resource forecast. We're going to use those as provided in 33.31.4 and other further implementation details in the BPM. But do note that the forecast used at 9 a.m. in the 9 a.m. advisory run will be the forecast used in the 10 a.m. binding run, unless folks, unless the BPM is going to allow for some further adjustment. At this point, we aren't really considering that BPM will allow for further adjustment, and so we could end up deleting that language as this process goes along. We have it in here now if there's something that comes up. But again, just flagging that the forecast used at 9 will be the same forecast used in the binding run. Any questions on forecasting requirements? Going once, going twice. Okay. Imbalance reserve requirements, just a general high level. Anytime we're trying to reference a DAME section, those sections, cross references are not accurate right now. We will get those right when the DAME tariff is ready for publication. So for now, please just know that these ones that include an X are to the DAME tariff, and I've included a comment bubble to indicate that for you. Again, imbalance reserve requirements are going to be calculated at 6 and 9. The one that is used at 9 will be used at 10 unless the BPMs allow otherwise. Again, at this point, we're not envisioning that the BPMs would allow otherwise, and so we may remove that language. Ancillary service requirement. This kind of goes to, I think, what folks were just discussing above. So each EDAM entity, so that's everyone other than CAISO, each EDAM entity must determine the requirements for ancillary services, and their scheduling coordinator communicates those requirements to CAISO for the advisory and binding runs. The timeline to do that, as well as the process, will be in the BPM. The ancillary service requirements used in 9 a.m. will be the same ones used in the final binding at 10 a.m., unless the BPM allows otherwise. CAISO's balancing, CAISO ancillary service requirements will be determined in accordance with Section 8 of the CAISO tariff and used in the binding RSE. And so I know there was some discussion earlier above about self-provision of ancillary services and how that works. And I think this language is what George was answering with, in that the self-provision and the EDAM entities the EDAM entities will set their ancillary service requirements and communicate those to us. That's not something that CAISO is doing for those entities. And the time to do that will be in the BPM. Are there any questions on the three obligations, or the three requirements of the RSE, the forecast requirement, the imbalance reserve requirement, or the ancillary service requirement? Okay, see none. This section 33.31.1.2.2 addresses transfers between balancing authorities in support of their EDAM RSE. Again, as I highlighted above, folks might want to watch for further training down the road on kind of transferring for the EDAM RSE requirements. But the thought is that resources in one balancing authority may count for those in another EDAM balancing authority area, and the CAISO will account for those. Questions? Okay, so we set the requirements by accounting for the transfers, as well as the three elements that I discussed above. So now CAISO will perform the resource sufficiency evaluations. Again, we didn't get a lot of comments here, but so these red lines you see are mine, and they're cleaning it up. As this comment bubble notes, the language you see deleted here was moved above, and then it was reworked a little bit. So I'm not removing anything substantive here. I was just better organizing. So I'm going to highlight this because it gets a little unwieldy with all the red lines. But this is the only section that's going to remain right here as the lead-in, which is the EDAM RSE will evaluate whether the RSE eligible supply is sufficient to meet each of the upward and downward components of the requirements established for the balancing authority as provided above and as we just walked through. So that is simple. And again, this deletion language is really just moved above and better consolidated. So now we'll move into our three evaluation side of the equation. We'll do a demand evaluation. Each balancing authority must meet its demand forecast and variable energy resource forecast requirements. That's the demand evaluation. Imbalance reserve evaluation, similar. Ancillary service evaluation, I cleaned up the language to kind of add that to reflect the self-provision of ancillary services. So everyone must meet their ancillary service requirements as determined above, and the CAISO must meet its ancillary service obligations as provided in Section 8. So again, these red line edits are just kind of administrative cleanups and making some consistency throughout. Are there any questions on performing the RSE? Okay, you pass the RSE if you meet all those requirements that we just walked through. Then inclusion in the EDAM upward pool. Again, some of these red lines are just cleaning up the language to make clear. So a balancing authority in the EDAM area, which again includes CAISO. So the EDAM entities that pass by satisfying the upward requirements in each hour, or that cure through the IFM and pay the applicable surcharge, will be placed in the EDAM upward pool. Everyone in the EDAM upward pool will be collectively accounted for when the EIM RSE is performed. Note that the EDAM upward pool will be evaluated as a collective in accordance with Section 29.34M, which is the flex test, and not otherwise evaluated under 29.34K through L. So let me see if I can get this all on the screen, everything but the heading. Inclusion in the upward EDAM pool. The language is on screen. Again, I didn't receive any comments on this section, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to walk through those now on how the upward pool works. I realized I forgot to ask for phone questions. Brenda, do we have any phone questions?
There are no questions in our phone queue at this time.
Okay. If I forget to ask, someone please just stop me. I've been trying to watch the chat and the hands. Okay, so that was the upward pool. The downward pool is much of the same metric, and you'll see the same administrative cleanups here on the screen. So the balancing authorities that pass the final RSE by satisfying the downward requirements of the 3 components in each hour of the day-ahead market, together with any balancing authorities that have cured their downward failure, are placed in the EDAM downward pool. They are collectively accounted for when performing the EDAM RSE, with the EDAM downward pool evaluated as a collective in accordance with 29.34M. Okay, exclusion from the upward and downward pool. So if the balancing authority was included in the pool pursuant to above, but they will be excluded for any other reason, such as failure to tag, which we'll get to. And so if you're excluded, you will be evaluated as an individual balancing authority in the EIM resource sufficiency evaluation. I just realized there was we were missing that similarity there in accordance with 29.34M. Any questions about the pools? Okay, that was the pools. Now, embedded in the requirement of the pools, if you failed the RSE and your failure was cured through the IFM upon incurrence of the surcharge. This section is the surcharge. I'm going to preview that, of course, the surcharge is also discussed in the settlement section, and it's discussed in much more detail. So I'm going to run through this at a high level. We're going to come back to 33.11.3. I'm forgetting the exact subsection, but for the settlement for these charges. And so we can get into those details there. I don't want to folks think I'm skipping over these, but I also don't want to get lost in some of these details when we're going to discuss it later. So, but let's talk at a high level. So there are 3 charges. There's the on-peak upward charge. There's the off-peak upward charge. And then there is a downward charge. So let's cover the on-peak upward first. So it's a 3-tiered penalty structure. Tier 1 is a de minimis failure, defined as the higher of 10 megawatts or an amount that is less than or equal to 1% of the upward imbalance reserve requirement for that hour. De minimis exceptions do not incur a surcharge. Any questions on tier 1? Okay, tier 2. So you are above the de minimis, but you are less than or equal to 50% of your upward imbalance reserve requirement. Then you will pay the on-peak upward failure insufficiency surcharge. Oh, here it is, as provided in 33.11.2. This is where we'll discuss that surcharge more. Section 3 or tier 3 failure, if your failure is greater than 50%, then you'll also pay the on-peak upward surcharge calculated, and we'll get into that later. Any questions about the high level of the tiers of the on-peak upward failure insufficiency surcharge? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to the off-peak upward failure insufficiency surcharge. It's a mouthful. Okay, so let's see. If you fail during the off-peak period, let me just, oh, here, sorry, I did it a slightly different way. That's what I was missing there. So if you fail in the upward direction during any off-peak hour, you will not incur the surcharge if you experience a de minimis failure. Otherwise, and I wrote it up here in the first sentence, you will pay it. Now that I've read this out loud, I'm realizing that it doesn't read as nicely as the one before it. So expect that I'm going to do some little rearranging just to make it follow a similar structure. I find this one to be a little bit confusing. So you'll see some red lines come out with some reorganization. But would anyone like to discuss the off-peak upward failure insufficiency surcharge? Okay. So then moving on to the downward failure insufficiency surcharge, we received a few comments from a number of folks, and we can discuss it more in 33.11 for any sort of debate or room around the edges. But we have some time between now and then. So I'm just going to note the policy paper didn't have a de minimis exception for the downward failure insufficiency surcharge. And if you look at that section of the policy paper, what you'll see is a discussion that the rationale for the downward surcharge is different than the upward surcharges. You know, the upward surcharges are intended to be penalties for failing to meet the resource sufficiency standards. The downward failure surcharge was really crafted to prevent an inappropriate arbitrage or inappropriate profit-making opportunity. I believe that was the reason the de minimis exception was not included in the policy paper. Folks should take a look at that. I think we're happy to engage in a bit more discussion of that when we're in the settlement section. I wanted to provide the preview of that now, though, in case anyone did want to pull up the policy paper to refresh the reasoning behind this surcharge. And I think if you look at that reasoning, you know, it becomes clear that maybe a de minimis exception is not really warranted. But again, happy to discuss it more at the time. But for this charge, if you fail in the downward direction, you incur the surcharge. Any questions? Okay. You must submit your e-tags timely to remain in the EDAM pool. So earlier we talked about getting excluded from the pool, either by never being included in it in the first place or here. This is the other way to get excluded from the pool because you must comply with the tagging protocols set forth in 3330 as well as the BPMs. We had a comment from Idaho Power about, you know, failure to tag. If they fail to tag, it does not otherwise resupply. And Idaho's question was about, well, what does that mean on resupply? And so we did add that clarification that it's a resupply from a physical source to cover the untagged imports and exports for that operating hour. And we were going to put those details in the BPM. We were not offering again, the policy paper did not contemplate a de minimis exception for failure to tag. It is kind of intended more as strict liability standard. We do have a replacement option if there is a failure to tag, and therefore we think that takes care of the need for any sort of de minimis exception. You know, and we're worried if we do provide that de minimis exception to the tagging requirement, we start eroding the integrity of the pool. If everyone gets a de minimis exception, those de minimis can add up. So I do know we received at least one comment on de minimis exceptions on tagging. Happy to have further discussion about it now. And Alva, I see I have your hand up. Maybe it's about this or something else. But let's unmute Alva, and Alva, just orient us to what section I should be in for your question.
This would be the previous section on the downward
sure.
de minimis. I wondered if you could give a little bit more information about the arbitrage that you were trying to prevent by excluding that. It seems like it's pretty much based on resources and resource capabilities, so I don't understand why there'd be a difference.
So I'm going to scoot up here. So let's see. If folks review, I know I put the citation to the policy paper up here somewhere. I just have to refresh my memory for where it is. Okay. Alva, the policy paper goes into it in section, I apologize for this numbering, but it's Roman numeral 2, large B, number 2, sub G as in girl, sub 1, sub C as in cat. Or you can, of course, just control F, the downward failure insufficiency surcharge. But there's a paragraph in there on preventing profit through the downward surcharge. And I think I'm going to I'll have it ready for up. I don't have it up now, but I'll have it ready for up on the screen when we get up here to the 33.11. And I'm happy to go into kind of more detail then, but can we table for now?
Yeah, okay. I mean, it just didn't seem, you know, with BAAs, I'm trying to understand who is profiting and why this would be an opportunity of that sort. So.
Well, Danny, do you have a quick answer? I don't want to butcher what is in the policy paper without having it up in front of me. We can also just table the discussion for later, but did you have a quick response?
Sure, Heather. The general concept, Alva, is that we want to encourage each BAA to have sufficient downward flexibility to balance their own load. So we don't want the EDAM to be an avenue that lets BAAs not plan to balance their own load. So the thought is, if they're not able to balance their own load, the EDAM can help them, but they should essentially get no paid for their inability to provide downward flexibility.
Well, I mean, that in concept, that makes sense, but we're talking about like a de minimis violation where the entity might be providing some downward flexibility, and it's simply a matter of the way the CAISO's calculation happens to work on a particular day. I'm just not seeing a sort of systematic arbitrage opportunity. The general concept that you're expressing would seem to apply to the larger violations, not the smaller ones.
So you're saying that you think a de minimis, because I guess when we thought about
just
this
on principle,
policy basis, it seemed more appropriate not to have a de minimis because this is just an hourly, essentially no pay as compared to the upward failures, which is based off a on-peak energy block.
Okay.
Well, thank
yeah.
you, Danny, for the quick response. But Alva, why don't you? I think wasn't time, so we have lunch, and then I think we're going to get to 3311. I think we should discuss it more. You weren't the only. I know you're on the phone now for it, but it came up in a number of people's comments. So let's leave room for the discussion. Folks can check the policy paper. I think Danny gave a quick response. I'm sorry, I didn't see. I think Carly, but I'm sorry, I didn't get the full name. Asked a question in the chat about what does a timely submission of an e-tag mean. And so up here in 33.30.8.3, you know, we have for the non-resource specific forward supply contracts, they under 33.30.8.2 must have a submitted e-tag within 3 hours following publication of the day ahead market results. And let's see, an EDAM entity scheduling coordinator has 5 hours before the start of the operating hour, and I think there's a bit more detail here, but Carly, I'm just going to reference you up to 33.30.8.3 on the timely submission of the tagging protocols. Of course, we are reserving that you know, the BPMs may have a bit more detail, but 33.30.8.3 should I think give you the good framework to start in. Okay. That is it, unless anyone has questions on RSE. We have a big chunk to go through when we go through the settlements, because that's how the surcharges are calculated. We'll have some further discussion of how this works through the EIM RSE when we get to section 29. But if there's no other chats or questions, I think, let's see, David, am I turning it back over to you for operation of the day ahead market in 33.31.2?
Yes, it's my turn again.
Okay.
Okay, so let me get my version of the document back up, and let me just move a few things around on my screen, and we'll get rolling with the market stuff. Am I sharing the I can't tell right now. Okay, I'm sharing the Word document, correct?
Yes.
Yep, looks good, David.
Okay. All right, well then, here we are. We made it through the RSE, bidding, all that sort of stuff, and we're actually here ready to operate the day-ahead market as part of the EDAM. So this is what the whole point is here. So, you know, there weren't actually a ton of comments here. You know, largely the point was to just apply once you get into the market timeline, it's just applying the existing day-ahead market over a broader footprint. So it's you know, in concept, this isn't where the hard stuff is. So going to the comments, I'll just start here. You see there's a comment in the RUC MPM in the EDAM area comment, and this is a general comment, so I'll address it here. You know, globally, a lot of questions or comments about how there was cross-references to tariff sections that, you know, don't exist. And I think in the RSC context, Heather might have mentioned that as well. There are lots of new sections and new material in section 31, which is the main day-ahead market section. New sections, new material to implement the day-ahead market enhancements, the important parallel initiative that's happening as well with EDAM. So, like, for example, here, the RUC MPM, RUC market power mitigation process is a new thing as part of the day-ahead market enhancement. So this is cross-reference to section 31.9. That is a DAME topic. And, you know, as you see in the note here, the DAME tariff sections will be shared shortly. We're hoping very much in the next 2 weeks to have that finalized internally so that we can get it out to you all to review. So that's, you know, a comment that came up multiple places. But yeah, the RUC MPM is a new thing that would apply in the CAISO BAA as well as in the EDAM. And so here you see, this is just a cross-reference to that. And so any questions, comments about, you know, any of those DAME topics, you know, we'll handle in the DAME tariff process. So for now, the way we like to handle is just say, this is a cross-reference, you know, whatever the process will be in DAME, that's what it is for EDAM. And then if we have questions about, you know, how the RUC MPM will work, reasonable questions, but that's a thing we'll handle in the DAME tariff process that will be kicking off, as I said, hopefully very soon, because you know, there's of course a lot of interdependencies between the two initiatives. Okay. So then moving on, and you know what, let me just stop there. I think that's a global topic, so I'll stop there if there's any question on that issue, because I wasn't planning to really address those comments in the other sections, you know, just skip them because that's sort of a global issue to deal with. And if there's not, I'll move on, but you know, if you have questions about that, you know, you're welcome, we'll get to them.
No comment.
Okay, fair enough. Okay, so moving on, in the net export transfer constraint, there were some, I think, comments about when we were talking about what the timeline is to elect to enable the net export transfer constraint. I think we were, you know, in the first draft we put out, it was a little, you know, it was not a tariff. The tariff defined timeline is just going to be deferred to the business practice manual. We've added some clarity in the tariff language itself that says the election has to happen prior to 9 a.m. on the day before the trading day, and then the specific details of how you make the election will be in the BPM. But the deadline of 9 a.m. on the day that the day-ahead market is run for the next day, that's the deadline to make the election to enable the constraint. Okay, then we move on to the non-deliverability risk section. So I mentioned, you know, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes ago or something, this was moved from the bidding section 33.30 into the core, you know, market section 33.31. So we've moved this language, it's relocated here. And you know, in addition to the moving, there was a lot of, or at least some questions, I believe, on sort of how this was going to work. You know, there was this idea that if there's observed evidence of non-delivery, then, you know, the EDAM entity or the ISO may apply a confidence factor of less than 100% to reflect, you know, sort of correct for the likelihood that there will be non-deliverability. And so there's questions about, you know, what the process is, how we bound the discretion. And so you see a few, you know, clarifying edits. And I think here it's hard to track what was incremental, but, you know, this is the current language we we've settled on for the moment, and we'll give you a chance to look at that on the screen. And then in the meantime, I think I saw something pop up that said Todd Ryan had raised a hand. So why don't you go ahead, Todd? We'll take your question.
Todd Ryan, Pacific Gas and Electric. So my understanding is that particular parameter is being discussed in a separate initiative. And so I might suggest that we simplify the language such that it's the CAISO sets this parameter but does not determine how it's being set, as that's still an ongoing policy discussion in a separate initiative.
Well, David, I just want to note this provision is for both EDAM entities or the CAISO.
Right. So Todd, I think what you were saying is the provisions about enabling or setting that confidence factor for the CAISO is what's being handled in that other initiative. But if I understood that part right, it would still be.
Let me ask another follow-up question then, Heather. Would the CISO balancing area and all other balancing areas have the same exact confidence factor based on this empirical evidence if other balancing areas were to choose to allow intertie bidding? Is that what this language suggests?
No, this is not intended, though. I think Milos, this might be your responsibility. I think it's Milos, you should speak up if I'm wrong. But this is not intended to be uniformity, Todd. I believe this is intended that each EDAM entity and the CAISO, so each individual acting for the individual, may register a confidence factor.
Well, then, again, my suggestion is that the language states that each individual EDAM entity can set their confidence factor and not specify the manner in which they set it.
Though, Todd, before you go on mute, and I'll probably kick myself for asking this later, but note that this is the language that frames up what that confidence factor is and what we're doing with it for all balancing authorities, including the CAISO. I think we can absolutely add the individual language. I just wanted to flag that.
My objection is that the language presupposes that this is going to be based solely on empirical evidence, and that's an ongoing policy discussion and then this separate initiative. And other balancing areas, again, if I was just an independent balancing area, I want the autonomy, authority, sovereignty to set it as I choose.
So is your proposed? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So that language might suggest that if I were, say, joining the balancing area, that I might have to present data to justify my confidence factor.
Well, I think we'd welcome edits on this section from all, if these are not the words that folks feel adequately represent the non-deliverability risk. Again, that would apply to the framework applies to all. The individual number would be set by the individual entity. So I think we're happy to take those comments now, but if there's edits to the language, I think there will be a time to comment on the tariff as a whole as well.
All right. Thank you for listening. Appreciate it.
Okay. So then, we'll take those comments on the confidence factor, how it's set, and then the reliability margin to use in the net export constraint, sort of parallel concepts here. Okay, so then moving on, and again, we'll consider whatever further clarity is appropriate in that section on the non-deliverability risk. Okay, moving on to the forecasting questions. So CAISO forecast of BAA demand for EDM entities. So there's the existing concept in the ISO market today. There's CAISO forecast of CAISO demand is the existing term. And so I think in this initiative, we've put in the change to that term, say CAISO forecast of BAA demand. And that's to capture that there will be a separate demand forecast for each of the BAAs that are part of the EDAM. And so today, the CAISO has established ways of creating the demand forecast for the CAISO BAA, but then we have to figure out what do we do to get that similar forecast for the other BAAs that may be part of the EDAM. So that's what this section is about. And then the, generally, and then so there was a comment and some incremental edits. So I'll go first with the sentence I highlighted on the screen. This is just to clarify that the EDAM entity, when they select a forecast option, that will roll into the real-time market. So, the material above, which doesn't have any incremental edits, is saying that we developed the demand forecast with the, based on procedures, input of the EDAM entity. But then, however, whatever choices are made, that's the forecast that rolls into the real-time market. So we can't, we can't have, toggling, different forecasts or different forecast methodologies for the day ahead in real time. And then in the next sentence, there was a reference about average loss factors that would apply. We just made a little bit of a clarification there. The EDAM entity that's submitting, its own forecast, we said average loss factors. I think the better way of phrasing that is the expected transmission loss as defined in the respective EDAM entity tariff. Average loss factors, I think we're getting at the right idea, but it just didn't quite frame it correctly. It's whatever the tariff, whatever the EDAM entity tariff sets out as the transmission losses, just apply that methodology into how the forecast rolls into the ISO process. And that's really just the point. I'll finish this section. I see Alva Svoboda has raised a hand. We'll get to that in just a moment. And then there was a question, there was a sentence addressing how this works for supply-only BAAs. We sort of excised the terminology of average loss factors in the sentence above, and then talking about how average loss factors apply in a supply-only BAA. That was always a little bit of an odd concept, but we struck that sentence and just added this sentence instead to clarify how we're going to treat this for supply-only BAAs, which is that the demand forecast will be treated as 0 for supply-only BAA, and hopefully that, I think it was Pattern Energy, if I recall, had questions there. So hopefully that kind of makes it clear on what the treatment would be for supply-only BAAs. And then finally, in the last sentence there, you see strikeout of the phrase constitutes that EDAM entities. I think that was just a typo. I think we just repeated that. Just correcting a typo there. So the next section is about how we would factor in load modification or demand response programs into the forecast of demand. But before we get there, I'll stop here. And I think, like I said, Alva, I think, had a hand raised, so we'll go there.
And David, after Alva, I think we have Carly, and then Alva will give it back to you. But I think we have Carly in the chat, and I think Sarah Thomas from the CPUC had a question as well.
And this isn't controversy. This is just, I wanted to make sure you used the word methodology, but that was sort of a careless application of the word to forecast option, I think, right? Your forecast option is the source of the forecast because in general, there are different methodologies applied for day ahead versus real-time forecast by anyone. So you're talking about who's the source of the forecast, right?
Yes.
Okay.
The forecast option as to whether it's,
ISO or
right.
the, right. Okay, thank you. That's all.
Yeah. Okay, and I'm sorry, was there another question teed up?
Let's see, I think Sarah Thomas shot me a note that she has a question. So if we could unmute Sarah, I don't know if she's on the WebEx or the phone. But then while we're getting Sarah unmuted, it looks like Carly Page had a question in the chat, David, about when we use the language, the EDAM entity or the CAISO, about, is the CAISO making a determination for itself or everyone? and kind of the individual or collective we were discussing a bit earlier. And so, Carly, I think generally it's that language is intended to capture the individual elections, but we can revisit it. I don't know if you were looking at specific language here and had edits, I think we can work those in. But then I think Sarah had another question. Oh, Sarah's on the phone line at 0510. So I don't know, we may need to give instructions on how to unmute the phone line for her.
Just 1 second, I'm currently unmuting the phone line. Okay. Sarah, your line is unmuted. You can go ahead.
Great. Sarah Thomas from the CPUC. Going back to non-deliverability risk, 33.31.3.1, there's a little nit that I just wanted to point out, but I had a bigger question. The nit is that it says non-deliverability risk in some places and non-delivery risk in others, and I don't know if that was intentional. It's up to, I don't have a strong feeling about that. But the second question is, the last sentence says, may further reduce the limit for its balancing authority area by an additional margin that reflects an amount of non-exportable capacity held back in anticipation of needing to respond to reliability conditions. And here's the language that I had a question about, as may be permitted under applicable rules, including the CAISO tariff. What do you intend to refer to there? Reliability conditions as may be permitted under applicable rules, including the CAISO tariff.
So the question is the phrase under applicable rules. What's the reference? What applicable rules would be applicable? I mean, is that kind of
and the tariff?
So David, I think at a high level, we were trying to capture what is now 33.31.3.2. I leave to you if there was more than the section below.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I mean, I think it's just sort of a generic reference to sort of other rules as they apply, maybe other.
Right. But I guess, yeah. I mean, I think that's clear. I think it's clear that you intend to incorporate other rules. I'm just not sure what other rules you're talking about.
So, Sarah, this is Danny from the ISO. I think it is explicitly referring to the reliability margin, and with regards to how those rules would apply to the CAISO BAA, that's what we're trying to determine in the CAISO BAA EDAM participation initiative.
So, Sarah, I think you called out maybe some drafting clarity that we can clean up. I think for purposes here, what we are intending to refer to is what is now 33.31.3.2 on the reliability margin. But look for this in a next round of edits, and I think we'll get this language a little more precise.
Thank you.
Okay, were there any other questions on, I guess, the non-deliverability risk / non-delivery risk section? And I was thinking about this more here. It's an interesting sort of, maybe we phrase it as risk of non-deliverability. Risk of non-delivery, and use that phrasing consistently. But Sarah, well, that's something we'll think about offline. I agree that is something we should be consistent about. Okay, so that's the non-delivery risk, the demand forecast, and then if there's nothing else, then I'll move into the load modification section. So yeah, this section is about if the CAISO or an EDAM entity has a load modification or demand response program that is not bidding in as a supply resource, how is that going to be reflected in the demand forecast that's run through the market? And so this is saying the EDAM entity may elect to adjust the forecast to account for such programs. And that we would expect that the demand response programs are enabled consistent with whatever rules there are in place within that jurisdiction within that entity to say when the demand response program will be enabled. You know, that if it's going to be rolling into the market as to net off demand forecast, and of course it should show up as it's posted. And then it says if the RSC requirements for the CAISO BAA are adjusted to reflect demand response programs in our entity, our BAA, then we'd adjust RUC participation to correspond to such adjustments. And then there's a general sort of statement at the end saying, you know, we're going to monitor and audit those performance of that demand response consistent with 33.38. And then so specifically, there was a question submitted in writing from Pacific Corp. And hopefully these various edits get at that, you know, get at the comment there. We're sort of clarifying how the forecasting, I'm sorry, how the load modification programs will fit in. And then so there was also concern from NV Energy about rule of reason and how much we could defer to BPMs. You know, we believe that we, you know, as proposed, this meets the rule of reason, and you know, especially if we added some additional clarity on these incremental edits.
And
Okay.
David, I'll just jump in there on the NV Energy point. You know, again, I'm realizing now, I'm not sure if our comment bubble is published in what you all saw, but this is part of an initiative, our CAISO BAA initiative, to allow CAISO to use certain demand response, supply side demand response programs, which we explain here in the comment bubble. And then if CAISO uses those to allow CAISO to make an adjustment to the RUC participation. This used to say RUC forecast, and agreed on we were imprecise there. So we cleaned up that language. As that other initiative resolves, this language may not be needed or may change in a different way. So I don't want to spend, I guess I'm just going to say, you know, watch for it in the next draft. We hope the comment bubble here addresses the concern, but of course, happy to have discussion on it.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Heather, for that additional comment. Okay, so keep rolling. You know, comments on the reserve sharing group section on the interchange schedule, and this is the last section. Oh, Alba, let me address this interchange schedule topic, and then we'll let you ask your question. So there's a section here talking about e-tagging timelines. This is a general section talking about the expectation of when schedules will be tagged. Idaho was expressing concern that section 33.30.8.3 had other tagging timelines. There's a concern that we might be setting up inconsistent rules on tagging. We don't think that's the case. 33.30.8.3 was setting out particular tagging rules for a scenario of capacity being used to meet the EDAM RSE. So that is a more strict tagging rule that applies in a more narrow circumstance. So this here, 33.31.6 is a generic obligation. And then there's a more specific rule that applies for capacity used to meet the EDAM RSE. So that more stringent rule would apply in that narrow circumstance. So that was the intent. You know, we didn't think it was inconsistent obligations. It was just that in the case of EDAM RSC, there's a more stringent requirement. And then, so with that, let me go back to Alva. You had a hand raised, so please go ahead.
No, Alva from PG&E. The previous section on the load forecast, and I think Heather might even, I was sort of just listening, and then I looked at it. So that load forecast, can that be used to modify the RSE?
If the elections are in before 9 a.m., it can be used to modify the RSE. So if you make an adjustment, you have to get the adjustment in, because again, our 9 a.m. forecasts are binding for the 10 a.m.
Okay.
So you don't have to count it to your RSE, but if you would like it to count to your RSE, adjustment needs to get in before 9 a.m. And we'll put that in the BPM, but.
Right, and in particular, if you need to count it to pass the RSE, you need to have it in by 9 a.m. So this is really great information. So this gets to your advisory runs prior, because it sounds to me like then the 8:30 run might be one that would be used by a BAA to determine whether they need to put those programs in order to modify their load forecast, if that's the only way they can satisfy the RSE. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
No problem. And again, we'll put the details on timing in the BPM, but yes, it'll be that 8:30 to 9 will be mostly if folks want to use it to pass the RSE. We'll need to receive things before then.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay, so that is the extent of what we had on 33.31 on the IFM and RUC. I'll just pause here. Final request for any questions or comments, because otherwise I think we're going to move into the greenhouse gas section, which is really a different set of rules and topics, and nothing that I'm going to be able to speak to. So if you have any final comments, questions on the sort of IFM RUC processes, you can raise them now, raise them in the second round of comments, but I'm going to pass the baton here in just a moment to, I think Andrew is going to handle the greenhouse gas section. And if there's no more comments, then I will stop sharing and pass things along.
There are no more comments in the queue at this time.
Okay, well, I stopped sharing, and I will, like I said, pass the baton to someone else on the team here who can handle the greenhouse gas section.
Hi, good morning. To those of you on the West Coast, good afternoon to those in other time zones. I'm Andrew Ulmer. I work with the ISO and the legal group, and I am going to talk to you about the greenhouse gas sections in the draft tariff language. Just checking, can you hear me and see the screen?
You're all good, Andrew?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, well, first, before we get started, I just want to say thank you to the internal team at the ISO who's working on greenhouse gas accounting design. It spans several departments, and folks have been great and very helpful as we move from the development of a policy for the extended day-ahead market into the development of tariff language, but also a thank you to folks who submitted comments on the draft tariff language. They've been pretty helpful as we reflect on it and make some refinements. Again, thank you. Three things I want to do today is just pause and provide sort of a high-level overview of the greenhouse gas accounting design for the extended day-ahead market. And then I really want to go through the various sections, the comments we received, talk about the red lines, and then finally take any additional comments, questions, observations here on the call we can try to capture. And as we continue to think about this language, perhaps incorporate those as we move forward to post the next red line version for stakeholder review. So I'll start with an overview of the design. I think many of you are likely familiar. In the policy phase of this effort, this initiative, we've elected for purposes of day one of the extended day-ahead market to utilize what has often been referred to as a resource-specific attribution approach for greenhouse gas accounting. It is built upon the approach we use today in the Western Energy Imbalance Market. So those of you familiar with that approach, it shouldn't be difficult to follow along too much with what we're doing here in the day-ahead time frame. I would say that an important note is as we're developing these rules in the day-ahead time frame, they will cascade into real time. So to the extent that the greenhouse gas accounting rules are relevant to you in the Western Energy Imbalance Market, the effort we're engaged in here today will affect those rules, and so it's important, I think, to follow the rule set through to Section 29 of the tariff later on. But in short, we're talking about in the EDAM area, the collection of balancing authority areas, including the ISO, that will be that will comprise the EDAM area. At day one of the extended day-ahead market, we anticipate having 2 greenhouse gas regulation areas. One, the state of California, the other, the state of Washington, but also areas of the EDAM area that are outside of a greenhouse gas regulation area. And we're defining greenhouse gas regulation areas as the collection of pricing nodes within a state jurisdiction that has priced carbon as part of a program to account for and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So that's sort of a different boundary area, if you will, than a balancing authority area. If you think about this conceptually, if you're a resource within the extended day-ahead market or a resource within the ISO balancing authority area, or a resource potentially, if we get to real time, within an EIM entity balancing authority area, you can be either within the greenhouse gas regulation area of the state of Washington, you can be within the greenhouse gas regulation area of the state of California, or you could be outside those areas. So that kind of creates a set of, necessary rules to articulate how the market process is going to treat those types of resources vis-a-vis the rule set for GHG accounting. But to go back to the resource-specific approach, effectively what we're utilizing, like we do in the Western Energy Imbalance Market today, is a bid adder, a separate bid adder that scheduling coordinators will be able to submit to signal a willingness to make capacity from their resource available to serve demand within a greenhouse gas regulation area at a certain price. And that price would be a cost-based price based on several factors. And so that is effectively the approach we use in the real time. It's the approach we'll extend to the day-ahead time frame. There's some additional rule sets, including something called the Greenhouse Gas Reference Pass, and that is a market process that will occur in the day-ahead time frame before the integrated forward market, and that essentially will create a reference schedule for resources that will help inform how much the IFM, the integrated forward market, will attribute or may attribute to that resource in terms of supply that is attributed as serving demand in the greenhouse gas regulation area. And the attribution really follows a sort of a simple rule set in the sense that it's the lower of the bid adder quantity that's presented by the resources scheduling coordinator, the dispatchable bid range between the resources reference schedule and its upper dispatchable economic limit, or its day-ahead energy schedule. So we're kind of creating a rule set for how much of a quantity a resource can receive in terms of an attribution to serve demand within a greenhouse gas regulation area. And one last sort of element I'll mention is the greenhouse gas net export constraint that we're proposing. This is a new constraint. This would extend into the real time as well, so it's relevant to the Western Energy Imbalance Market. And the constraint would further limit the ability of a resource to receive an attribution that it can serve demand in a greenhouse gas regulation area by the net exports, the net transfers from the balancing authority area in which the resource is located. So if a resource is located in a balancing authority outside of a greenhouse gas regulation area, and it submitted a bid adder to offer its demand or offer its capacity to serve demand in a greenhouse gas regulation area, it can only receive an attribution up to the quantities of net exports coming out of that balancing authority area. So the BA is a net importer. That resource may not receive an attribution. And so that creates some constraints in terms of the market, but it also is intended and will, all things being equal, mitigate the potential for what's often referred to as secondary dispatch or emissions from secondary dispatch, whereby the attribution of resources may extend below what today is used in the energy imbalance market as a base schedule. So that's a constraint that's new, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So with that, I will perhaps start with the tariff language, but I want to pause and see if there are any initial questions or observations. And I can't see the hands being raised, so if there are hands being raised, perhaps someone can track that and call on anybody.
We don't have any comments in the queue at this time.
Okay, great. Okay, well, so with that, maybe we'll start with going through the language. The language in section 33.32 starts with some relatively generic preparatory language about greenhouse gas bid adders. We received a couple of comments about it. One, really a formatting comment that the way that this section is structured and numbered is different from prior sections in 33, and we'll take that back and look to make some changes so that there is some better uniformity as between this section and the prior sections. There are also some comments about the need to draw a clear distinction between balancing authority areas versus greenhouse gas regulation areas. And we've tried to do that throughout in this incremental red line. We've tried to make that clear, how the rules work vis-a-vis resources located within a greenhouse gas regulation area versus outside a greenhouse gas regulation area, and hopefully the changes will make it clearer. In this first section, we've also tightened up the language a little bit. We've eliminated some of the language that we don't think is really necessary, although we may echo this language that we deleted, perhaps, well, certainly in our transmittal letter to explain the tariff sections, but also perhaps in our business practice manuals. Just go to scroll down. So 33.32A2 deals with bid adders, and it really talks about the purpose of the bid adders themselves, and we're referring to these as greenhouse gas bid adders, and also who may submit them. So the tariff language talks about the integrated forward market, how it's going to utilize bid adders to optimize the attribution of what we're referring to as greenhouse gas transfers into a greenhouse gas regulation area. And we've also talked about it generally from the perspective of if you're an EDAM resource outside of a greenhouse gas regulation area, but we also have parallel language reflecting that EDAM resources within the greenhouse gas regulation of the state of Washington, they also, the optimization will also use bid adders for them for the attribution of greenhouse gas transfers into greenhouse gas regulation areas outside the state of Washington, i.e. California in this case, and then a sentence that does the same for resources within California being able to submit greenhouse gas bid adders for attribution of GHG transfers into greenhouse gas regulation areas outside of the state of California, i.e. the state of Washington. We've talked a little bit about what the greenhouse gas regulation areas are. They're going to reflect pricing nodes within a state jurisdiction that is price GHG emissions as part of a GHG reporting and reduction program. And then the question becomes sort of which are the resources that are submitting these bid adders. As I mentioned, if the resources outside of a greenhouse gas regulation area, it will be submitting a bid adder to serve demand within that greenhouse gas regulation area. If a resource is within a greenhouse gas regulation area, it will not be submitting a greenhouse gas bid adder to serve demand within that greenhouse gas regulation area. So it gets kind of a complicated logic game, I suppose. But if you think about a resource in the state of California, it will not be submitting a greenhouse gas bid adder unless it is offering its capacity at a certain price to serve demand in the state of Washington, and vice versa. However, if a resource is outside the states of Washington, outside the state of California, and wants to serve demand in one of those greenhouse gas regulation areas, it will submit a greenhouse gas bid adder. So resources that are pseudo-tied or have a dynamic schedule into a balancing authority area within a greenhouse gas regulation area, those resources will not submit greenhouse gas bid adders. We'll treat them and model them as if they are internal, but they do have to register in the master file that they are associated with demand within the greenhouse gas regulation area. And in this section, we have language that parallels these rules for the state of Washington and the state of California. So this subsection involving bid submission, we did receive a comment from Idaho Power asking that we make it clear that there are separate bid adders for purposes of making capacity available to serve demand in each greenhouse gas regulation area. And so we've made a clarifying edit there. It was always our intent, but hopefully this language makes it more clear. Maybe I can just stop. I did see a hand come up. I think maybe Alva.
Just on the point you just raised, so if you have two adders, wouldn't the market process, from whatever point of reference you're going from, whether it's zero or a reference solution, would the higher of the two adders automatically be applied to the bid in the IFM process?
The IFM process would consider both bid adders in relationship to whether or not to attribute the resource to serve demand within the greenhouse gas regulation areas. So it would look at both of them. It won't select one and say, this is the only one we're going to utilize.
So the IFM will see alternative uses of the energy within the optimization. It will consider that a particular resource's bid energy can be used for one of three purposes, and it will select only one of those purposes, I'm guessing, or can it select for different portions of the bid for each of those regions?
And I'll ask for a lifeline from my colleague George Androlidis, but in theory, the optimization could attribute a greenhouse gas transfer to a resource that serves demand in the state of Washington, and a greenhouse gas transfer that serves demand in the state of California, and also dispatch the resource to serve demand outside of the greenhouse gas regulation area.
And each of those will be seen as having a different incremental cost in the optimization based on the bid adders.
Correct.
Yeah, that's correct, Alva. This is George. It's as Andrew mentioned, you have these three possible bids for three outcomes on how the capacity of the resource is going to be scheduled. Some portion may be scheduled to serve load outside greenhouse gas regulation areas. The incremental cost of that is the energy bid. Some portion could be scheduled to serve load in Washington. The incremental cost of that is the energy bid plus the greenhouse gas bid adder for Washington. And then some portion could be scheduled to serve load in California. The incremental cost of that is the energy bid plus the greenhouse gas bid for California. And any of these three outcomes are co-optimized. You could potentially have, all three happening in the result.
Do you make any assumptions about which parts of the bid curve get the adders or don't?
It's actually monotonically increasing all of them because the basic energy bid is monotonically increasing, and we only have a single segment, single price for the greenhouse gas bid adder, so that is adding on top of that. So essentially you have three competing monotonically increasing bids, and depending on how they intersect, you may have an outcome where you have an optimal allocation of the capacity of the resource between those three outcomes.
Okay. Thank you. Maybe when you do your mathematical formulation for the BRS, it'll be clear whether there's any integrality there. But that's helpful. Thank you, George.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move forward. So again, I mentioned this before, the bid adder, like it does today in the energy imbalance market, will consist of a price and a megawatt quantity. It is ostensibly a cost-based bid adder. It won't be less than zero. It's not going to be greater than 110% of the resource's maximum compliance cost is determined in accordance with a subsequent section in 33.32. This is language that echoes our market rules today. And then default treatment, if we do not receive a bid adder from a resource, it will not receive an attribution of a greenhouse gas transfer into a greenhouse gas regulation area. So again, like today, in the energy imbalance market, it is optional to offer your capacity if you're outside of a greenhouse gas regulation area to serve demand in that greenhouse gas regulation area. So the determination of the maximum greenhouse gas bid adder, it is a calculus that we do today. We do a daily calculation based on inputs, and that sets a ceiling. Resource isn't required to bid at that ceiling. They can bid below the ceiling, but we do establish that. And we did receive a comment from Idaho about how we described that calculus, and we made some changes. We hope will provide more clarity as to how that calculation works, and it really dealt with what was the heat rate we're using. And just to be specific, we're utilizing the highest averaged heat rate that we have on a resources heat rate curve. So it's really the least efficient point that informs the overall maximum GHG bid adder that a resource can submit. Today we had some explanation of this in our BPMs. We will also include explanations in the BPMs for the extended day ahead market, so we added some language with respect to that. And then in 33.32A4, a GHG bid adder price, we've articulated a rule that the bid adder may not be less than zero. You can't submit a negative bid adder, but also that the sum of the GHG bid adder and the energy bid price may not exceed the soft energy bid cap or the hard energy bid cap if that were to be in effect. And we did receive a comment from WPTF asking some questions about does this treat resources similarly or in a comparable manner? We think it does. I mean, this is a rule, effectively an artifact of our market, but to the extent that a resource is within a greenhouse gas regulation area, it can submit a bid up to the soft energy bid cap that would include its cost of compliance with any state greenhouse gas reduction program in that GHG regulation area. If the resource is outside of the state, it can submit an energy bid and a bid adder up to the soft energy bid cap that would also include its cost to comply with that program. So that's our thinking with respect to that. But it looks like Callie has a question, so maybe we can stop and maybe pursue this comment more.
Yeah, hi, Andrew. It's Callie Wills with WPTF. I just wanted to I appreciate your response. I kind of wanted to maybe provide a little bit more context to our comment. So because resources within the GHG area, so I'm just going to use California for an example, like you said, embeds their GHG compliance cost within their energy bid price, right? So their energy bid price, part of it reflects the GHG cost and the other part reflects their energy cost. And then if they also wanted to submit an energy bid adder to Washington, the way I read this is the sum of all three of those have to be less than 1,000, assuming the soft energy bid cap is in place. But if you have the same resource located outside of GHG areas, their energy bid price does not include any GHG costs. So for them, it's almost like their energy bid price plus the GHG bid adder to California has to be less than 1,000, and their energy bid price plus their cost to Washington has to be less than 1,000. So that's where it almost seems like it's slightly different treatment, and resources within California and in Washington are kind of further restricted because it's almost a summation of all three of those cost components are less than the bid cap. That's how I read this. If I'm misreading it, please let me know. But that was kind of the distinction I was going for.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think just peel back the onion. If you're a resource within the state of California and you're an emitting resource, you're covered by the state's greenhouse gas program rules. You're going to have to comply with them. And if you offer your output to serve demand in the state of Washington and you want to submit a greenhouse gas bid adder that's higher than zero, you're going to have to, and somehow you think your energy costs are right at the soft energy bid cap, you are going to have to back down that energy bid if you want to include a non-zero GHG bid adder to serve the state of Washington, and vice versa if you were in the state of Washington. If you were outside of those GHG regulation areas, I think your energy bid plus your bid adder to serve demand in the state of California could not exceed the soft energy bid cap, and likewise your energy bid and your greenhouse gas bid adder to serve demand within the GHG regulation area of the state of Washington couldn't exceed the soft energy bid cap. Of course, if you don't submit a GHG bid adder and you're outside of those GHG regulation areas, you could bid up to the soft energy bid cap. So, and we think that we're treating resources kind of on parity, and also kind of, I mean, at the end of the day, the election to offer a GHG bid adder is just that, it's an election. So if it creates an economic constraint for you, then I mean, a resource could opt not to do so.
Yeah, it just almost seems like we can follow offline on this. It just almost seems like resources inside California would, exactly how you said, would have to back down their energy offer. So even if their costs were up at the soft energy bid cap, they would have to back down their energy offer to provide another, to Washington, whereas a resource outside wouldn't have to back down their energy offer as much. But we can follow offline. I just wanted to make sure I was, and it sounds like we're reading this the same way, which I think still has that potential different treatment. So I'll follow up offline with you on this one. I don't mean to go through in detail here.
Yeah, and it should be the circumstances of the conditions that might give rise to it should be extremely rare as well. But certainly welcome a further discussion. We can pursue it and maybe schedule something with our policy team as well.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you for the comment, though. Thank you very much. Okay. I'm cognizant that we're close to the noon hour, but I would like to sort of make a stab at maybe getting us through this section and then turning it back to John and seeing if we can break for lunch. So I'm going to march on unless someone disconnects me. So the next section, 33.32B, deals with consideration of the bid adders in our market clearing process. This language largely is built on our existing Western Energy Imbalance Market language, but we've done some shifting and got some good comments, I think, on how we articulate what the IFM is going to do in terms of attributing a greenhouse gas transfer to an EDAM resource and what would be the limit of that. And again, I think I mentioned at the beginning, the limit would be a value that's equal to the lower of, so either the bid adder quantity or the dispatchable bid range between the resource's reference pass schedule and the resource's effective upper economic bid, or the resource's day-ahead energy schedule for that trading hour. So again, the quantity is going to be limited, and in this middle one, little two, the resource's dispatchable bid range between the resource's GHG reference pass schedule and the resource's effective upper economic bid largely is intended to help mitigate the potential for secondary dispatch, whereby by receiving the reference pass schedule, the resource has sort of an optimized sense of what quantity of its resource is needed to serve demand outside of the greenhouse gas regulation area, and then the delta between that and the resource's upper economic bid creates a value for which the resource may receive an attribution to serve demand in the greenhouse gas regulation area. We have similar language both for the greenhouse gas regulation area in the state of California and in the state of Washington. And then we have a description of the GHG reference pass. And again, I think I mentioned this at the outset, this is a market pass that occurs before the integrated forward market based on the bids and sell schedules we've received, and essentially serves as, in purposes of GHG accounting rules, the same purpose as a base schedule does today. Although we believe that the optimization based on the bids and the sell schedules will give us a more effective tool at mitigating the potential for secondary dispatch, i.e. attributions that would otherwise dip into base schedule quantities. Let me see if I can just make it through this section, and then Alba, maybe I will call out to you, but what I wanted to call out was that the reference pass, based on feedback we got in the policy initiative, the reference pass will not schedule capacity outside of the GHG regulation area. If that capacity is registered with us as having an obligation to serve demand within the greenhouse gas regulation area. Here the idea is that if you have this obligation, we want to make sure that the IFM has the opportunity to provide a full attribution to that resource to serve demand in the greenhouse gas regulation area, and we don't somehow foreclose that through our GHG accounting rules. And then, again, similar rules for resources with pseudo-tie arrangements or dynamic schedules that have registered with the ISO and explained that they are associated with demand within inside a greenhouse gas regulation area. So I'll stop there, and I'll maybe ask if you have a question.
Yes. Is there any difference in the in the treatment between the GHG transfer constraint and the inter-BAA transfer constraint? Is there any difference in the way imbalance reserves, particularly imbalance reserves from emitting resources, are treated?
I don't think so, but George, do you have an immediate reaction to that question?
Yeah, the two transfers are different. They work on different parallel planes, if I can say that. The BA to BA transfers, they're dealing with the power balance constraint for its balancing authority area. Greenhouse gas transfer is essentially the mismatch of the power balance for the greenhouse gas regulation area, so it's a different area. It doesn't align fully or maybe even not at all with the balancing authority area. And obviously, in the deployment scenarios, we do have the version of the power of the BAA to BAA transfer, which interacts with the power balance constraint for the BAA for imbalance reserves. But there is nothing like that for the greenhouse gas regulation area. So everything's co-optimized so that to a certain extent there are interactions, but they're not directly related or interact with each other. Aldo, I hope you find this answer satisfactory.
This is the GHG, and the GHG transfer limit is active in the IFM too, right? I mean,
yes, yes, it is, and they're all co-optimized. Right. So,
but it would only apply. It would only apply to actual. It would only apply to actual energy, is what you're saying.
Yeah, the greenhouse gas transfer is only actual energy. That's
okay.
The greenhouse gas regulation policy applies only to energy, not to capacity. It will apply to deployed capacity in real time. So we have the model in EIM. We'll catch it there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, George's comments are very helpful, and it may be a lot to ask, but we are kind of moving into a different plane of modeling, specifically with different areas than balancing authority areas. And that's why we've used this defined term, greenhouse gas transfers, in connection with those greenhouse gas regulation areas. So I'm going to keep moving the GHG marginal cost, essentially how we're going to identify a clearing price for GHG attributions in the IFM is very similar to how we do it today in the energy imbalance market. We'll create a shadow price based on this attribution, and that will essentially create a clearing price for GHG payments. And the compensation, this is a language that also ties back to Section 33.11 settlements, but essentially we're going to be creating a payment based on the marginal GHG cost for the respective GHG regulation area. If a resource receives an attribution, it will receive compensation that reflects the multiplication of quantity and the IFM marginal GHG cost. Now, it's a day-ahead settlement, of course. As we mentioned at the beginning, all this rolls into real time, so there'll be a deviation settlement as between the day-ahead market and the real-time market. We've done some editing to this section based on comments that we received from WPTF, where we went back up and tried to explain the attribution more clearly. Those are very helpful, and made this section all about the greenhouse gas net export constraint, which I mentioned at the beginning of the call, that essentially is an attempt to mitigate the potential for secondary dispatch by not attributing to resources within balancing authority areas that are net importers, and limiting the attribution to those resources based on the net export quantities from that BA. So creating a ceiling, if you will, for how many resources can receive, how many megawatts a resource can receive in terms of an attribution. Now, a couple of caveats. One is that if resources are registered with the ISO as having obligations to serve demand within the greenhouse gas regulation area, this constraint will not prevent their attribution. And further, if we have a BA that is not within, that we have a balancing authority that has a foot within the greenhouse gas regulation area, we will, either area, we will not enforce the constraint for that hour. If that BA is not passing the resource sufficiency evaluation in the upward direction. We recognize that this constraint, has the potential to affect, obviously, market outcomes. But if we're in a space where there is an EDAM entity that's not necessarily going to meet the RSC, we think it's not prudent to enforce the constraint. And then the last section deals with data availability. There was a question we got with respect to whether or not greenhouse gas reference path schedules will be made available. They will, of course, be made available. So we added some language just to clarify that. And then essentially the market results, through our market results interface, will identify the attributions to the scheduling coordinators that receive them for their resources, so that there's a knowledge of the quantity of megawatts that have been attributed to the resource to serve demand in the greenhouse gas regulation area. And that, I think, sort of ran the scope of 33.32. So let me stop and see if there are any last observations or questions or comments that folks have.
We do have one hand up on our phone-only line.
Let's take it.
Caller, your line is unmuted.
It's Sarah Thomas from the CPUC. In section 33.32.2, data availability, the B section, which is disclosure, which hasn't been edited, talks about the California Air Board and the Washington Department of Ecology. But earlier in the tariff, in 33.32A, those specific agencies names were eliminated, and it just talked about state regulation. So it occurs to me that it may make sense to do the same deletion here in substitution, because if, for example, the CPUC wanted this information and not just the Air Board, it might be appropriate for that to happen as long as the other rules are respected. So the fact that you deleted those specific entities above might suggest that you would use a different term here in B.
Yeah, fair observation, and I think that's something we can definitely take back. And for the benefit of folks on the call, the intersection between carbon reduction programs that states are pursuing and organized electricity markets sort of beg many questions about what data is available, what can be shared. And we have some real constraints under Section 20 of our tariff that govern how the ISO releases and manages confidential information, including information that market participants would consider market sensitive. And so figuring out how to navigate how we make data available in a way that's meaningful and helpful to state policymakers, but at the same time respecting that individual market participants have an interest in perhaps protecting their market information is the balance we're seeking. But Sarah, that's a fair comment, and I think that's something we'll take back and look at as we make the next iteration of redline edits. So thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay. Well, again, I really appreciate everything, and look forward to keeping the conversation going and talking to you again. But also, if there are offline conversations we need to have about specific tariff language or how this is framed, we are very much open to that. So, thank you for your attention. And with that, I will stop and turn it back to John Anders.
John, we're currently not getting any audio from your line. You might be muted on your end.
Yeah, maybe this is David here. Maybe I can go because I think the next thing up before lunch was just to really briefly address a comment on section 33.39, and then we'll do that. And then I think, unless someone tells me I'm wrong, that then we'll break for lunch after that and resume after lunch with the section 29 changes in which is the section on EIM. So let me just share real quick on section 33.9. Just sorry, real quick again. Can you hear me and see the screen share?
Yes, we can see it.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So just really quickly, this was, I think, the last comment to address in section 33. So there was just a question, the reference to the local market power mitigation procedures. This goes back again to the comment I had before in reference to the RUC MPM and a section above. Bank had questions about how the reference to local market power mitigation would relate to the new products in the day-ahead market enhancements, the imbalance reserves up and down, and then, you know, the reliability capacity down and so on. So here, these are additional cross-references to those tariff sections that will address that. And, but the broader response to bank asking, well, how's that going to relate? How it's going to relate is that there will be market power mitigation for the imbalance reserves up and reliability capacity up, and that's a topic covered in the day-ahead market enhancement proposal. So same mitigation that applies within the CAISO BAA would apply in EDAM. And again, that's just in that initiative, we said market power mitigation will apply to the up products for reliability capacity and balance reserves. So that is the answer to that question. And if there's any questions on that, we can take it. Otherwise, I think that is it for now, and we will break for lunch.
Thank you, David. I know John's having technical issues, but we can go ahead and proceed on having our lunch for 1 hour. So we'll be meeting back here at 1:15 Pacific time. And so Silas will be putting up the slide for the lunch slide, just a reminder. But other than that, we look forward to seeing everyone at 1:15 Pacific time. Thanks, everyone.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back from lunch. We are going to move now to section 29, the WEIM tariff provisions, and these edits now reflect incremental changes from the version of section 29 that's on file, and we have attempted to shade incremental changes from what was posted in this version, but not necessarily in all cases. So we'll just go through it like we've been going through, and please feel free to raise your hand if you have any questions. So starting off, we have some very high-level introductory language. This parallels the EDAM section in section 33.1. And here we added a statement to clarify that if you're in the EDAM, so market participants in an EDAM BAA and the BAA as a whole, if it's participating in EDAM, then the operation and settlement of the real-time market is influenced by the outcomes produced in the day-ahead market. And you also have to reference section 33 to get the full picture of both the day-ahead market and the real-time market for those participants. However, Arizona had a question, or APS had a question about this, and was, it seemed at least to me, concerned potentially about expansion or somehow inadvertent application, and the answer is no, this does not expand application of section 33 to EIM participants, except in the case where there have been changes, and the two are the GHG area, which Andrew mentioned, and then the RSE area, which Heather described. in those areas, there are changes to the real-time market, but those are changes for everybody in the real-time market that were a result of the EDM stakeholder process. So we'll get to those in a minute, but just wanted to provide that assurance to Arizona or ABS. All right. So here we had some questions from Pacific Core about participation and whether the participants are in the day-ahead market or if there's a separate market called it like the extended day-ahead market or EDAM. And again, we want to clarify that the day-ahead market is being extended through the provisions in Section 33. And just like the extension of the real-time market under Section 29, there are external balancing areas that are participating, and they participate in the real-time market under the provisions of Section 29. And if they agree to extend that participation to the day-ahead, they will participate under Section 33. But it's not a new or separate market. It's the same market for everybody. Obviously, there are some differences between participants in day-ahead and real-time, and then in certain limited cases between the ISO balancing area and other balancing areas, and that's really about the relationship between the ISO as BAA and how we operate as an ISO RTO and provide transmission and services and all of that under the CAISO tariff. But with that, I did see a hand go up from I think it was Chris Jones, Troutman, Council for Pacific Coast. Chris?
Yeah, I think the question we had raised there was the first draft used a defined term, extended day-ahead market. Have you gotten rid of that as a defined term?
No, we still have a defined term, extended day-ahead market, but it's used in very narrow or limited circumstances. And it's only to refer to the context of this market that has been extended. It's not to refer to it as a separate market. It's the extension of the day-ahead market. I know it's a little bit confusing, but hopefully that's helpful. Chris.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, so throughout you'll see the participation and the operation and settlement and everything else. It's the day-ahead market or the real-time market, as applicable. And of course, we have all the defined terms, EDM blank or EIM blank, to focus your attention on new defined terms for participation in the real-time or day-ahead market. Okay. Okay, so now I'm kind of jumping just because there's not a lot of changes in some of these sections. So rather than scrolling through all the changes, but here we have our first instance, and we did receive a lot of comments about this. So I'll cover it now and then take any questions, and then we can move on from that. But essentially, several stakeholders, and particularly in this section 29 and Appendix A as well, there were some clarifications we made to references to whether it was an EIM participating resource or an EIM resource and the like. And we've gone back through and double checked everything. And we're comfortable with where things were. And there is one section, and I'll call that out in a moment, where Pacific Core correctly highlighted that it was not appropriate to add a reference to EIM resources. But the bottom line is that in the ISO markets, we have a distinction between the physical facility, the generating unit, and then the owner operator of those facilities, the participating generator, and those terms are the ISO terms. And then so we've decided, and we did it with the energy imbalance market, to use parallel references. And so we have a term EIM resource, which is the physical facilities, and then EIM participating resources, which is the owner operator. And then it gets a little more complicated because we've added the EDAM and resources that were EIM participating resources become EDAM resources, and then we have the defined term EDAM resource facility for the EDAM. So I apologize, it's a little convoluted, but we're not trying to change anything as it applies to existing or future EIM participants or the extension of the market into that day ahead. So I think this is worth opening up for question now so we can kind of go through the rest of these areas quickly. Do we have any questions?
We don't have any comment. Chris Jones just put his hands up again.
Sorry, John, I couldn't help myself. So just so I'm clear, I mean, the participating resource definition was put in there in the EIM because there's such thing as a non-participating resource. And so I'm not clear based on the comments where you landed on this. Are you getting rid of the word participating in that definition? And are you saying it's just cleanup and the definition of EIM resource will sort of by default be the participating resource?
No, it's a little different than that. It's a good question. So we're maintaining the distinction between the physical facilities and the generator owner or operator. So we're going to have that in both EDAM and EIM as we do in the CAISO BAA. And where you see this stricken out, that means we're talking about the physical facilities. And that's why this definition has been changed to reference EIM resources, which is a defined term and always has been, versus the EIM participating resources. So you can look at those definition of EIM resources. That may help. I get the distinction with non-participating. We've cleaned that up into areas that have been pointed out to us. But
so in this
Chris,
particular...
Chris, this is Heather. And so I don't know if you can see the comment on the side, but in the definition of EIM resource, if you go pull that definition, you'll see it has a number of parts to it. But the last part of that definition is an EIM resource must be subject to an EIM participating resource agreement. So John, you can confirm, but I believe when we use the term EIM resource capitalized, that does not include a non-participating resource. Was that your question, Chris?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand why this change is being made here, but in the EDAM initiative. And I guess what you're telling me is you're just trying to align the definitions, is that right? So that this lines up with the definition of EDAM resource?
Yeah, it's a little of that and a little bit of cleanup. Maybe this should have said EIM resources throughout before, and we're catching it now that our focus is on it. And so that's why it's really just intended to be an administrative change and not a substantive change. And the definition or the distinction between the participating resources and non-participating resources should be captured because only participating resources are capitalized EIM resources.
Yeah. The reason I'm focusing at all on this is that, for an EDAM entity, resources are going to lose the ability to non-participate in the EIM. And so that change will jump off the page as perhaps intentional and consequential. So, we can explain it away at the appropriate time. I just wanted to flag why it jumped off the page to us.
Fair enough, yeah. And on this, provision, we're looking at the identified EIM resources. That would not change, but that reference to non-participating resources, which is not a defined term, those are what would become the EDAM resources. So, okay, are we good? Should we move on? Okay.
We're probably good, John.
We don't have any further questions.
Yeah, and I think we'll just make sure we provide a full explanation because, again, it intended to be only administrative.
All right. The next question was from Pacificor, and their question was about whether there was any change in the stored historical data terms of the real-time market, and the answer is no, that this is a market operation. So if you've done all this and registered all your historical data purposes of the real-time market, that would carry over and be fulfilled in terms of the day-ahead market. And if there is any additional details needed, it will be covered in the PPM. Okay, so the next comment, again, just to orient people, we are in now moving along, and we've jumped all the way from the beginning of the tariff, and now we're in section 29.7. And so here, Portland General requested that we carry over the communication and coordination details from the EDAM, which was an enhancement to this provision. So we've added that language in here so that it's more clear in both contexts that the communication and coordination amongst the impacted entities is appropriate. And so I'm going to keep moving along, and feel free to stop me, but if I'm going to try to focus on all the comments, and then if there's anything I pass over along the way, let me know. Again, this was an area, and you can see here the title was non-participating resources. So now we're all the way down into section 29.11. So we're into the settlements section of the real-time market, and we had added in references to EDAM resources where we thought it was appropriate in this settlement section for the real-time market. And here we added something that we shouldn't have, and Pacific Core correctly pointed that out. So we'll take that back out because this deals with non-participating resources, not EDAM resources or EIM participating. And in EDAM, there are no non-participating resources, so this issue is solved with that edit. All right, so again, here we're still in the settlement area, and we're talking about non-participating loads. So this is another CAISO terminology kind of quirk, and in the ISO, we call it non-participating load. So this is load that is not subject to treated like a resource. In other words, it's all other load, it's normal load, it's all of that, and this is the calculations associated with imbalanced energy for load, and in the case of an EDAM BAA, we'll reference the day-ahead schedules as whether or not there's been an imbalance on the load side. So, any questions on that? Okay.
No questions at this time.
Thank you. And now Pacific Core asked a clarification. So this now, we're still in the settlement section, and here we're dealing with the settlement of the over/under scheduling charges that can accrue to a BAA that is not balanced. So this is an energy imbalance market feature. It does not apply to the CAISO balancing area because we're in the day-ahead market, not the real-time, so there's no balancing test. And this was specifically addressed in a later section of the tariff. I won't go there now, but it's existing tariff language. So what this does then is when a BAA joins the EDAM, they're no longer subject to the balancing test, and they wouldn't be included in either the assessment of these over/under scheduling charges or the allocation of any revenues associated with the collection of these charges from balancing areas that are not balance? So that's a good question, and I think that should clarify it. And did try to make it generic. We said, I think, a balancing area that's not in the day-ahead market, so that it would cover the EDAM situation or circumstance. Okay. So now we are in the area of neutrality, and here we, in the context of the energy imbalance market, we had referred back to these settlement sections for the determination of these offset allocations. And we're still going to do that going forward, and we can catch up when we get to section 11 on the proposed changes there. But this change here is really intended just to communicate to everyone in the real-time market that because we are now separating out congestion revenue from transfer revenue, and that applies in both the day-ahead and real-time markets, that allocation will occur, and that it requires a new cross-reference here in the real-time settlement provisions, but the allocation, calculation, and determination of all of that is in section 11. Okay. Okay. So here we got a comment. Can't recall which stakeholder it was, but the basic comment was about the availability of these transfer limits at EDAM interties in the real-time market. So we've made some clarification here to make it clear that the transfer limits. So now you're going to have EDAM transfers that are the result of the optimization in the day-ahead market coming out of the market, and those are, available transfer capability to the flows in the real-time market, but they're not going to be re-optimized within the real-time market. And instead, we're going to establish separate transfer limits, EIM transfer limits, to represent the transmission capacity from the day-ahead market to each internal enterprise. So this makes sure that the capacity available for EDAM transfers remains available in the real-time market, and any other capability from the day-ahead or earlier time frames would be subject to a separate EIM transfer limit, and then it would be managed according to the EIM transfer limit rules, which are in section 29.17. And also, 29.7 and 29.17. Okay, so that's just a clarification because, now you have these new transfer limits at internal interties as a result of the day-ahead market optimization, and then you have to also account for them in the real-time market, and so that's what this section does. Okay. Now we're skipping way ahead, so we just fast forwarded from section 29.17 all the way to 29.29. So this section was previously blank because in the ISO tariff, section 29 is the EIM tariff. But here, Pacificor raised the question about the concept needing some attention. And I'll spend, a minute or two on this just conceptually and make sure it resonates with everybody. But the bottom line is that, similar to the ISO tariff, you have the market participants, and there's different provisions for the day-ahead market and the real-time market, and those two markets are connected, right? They don't exist independent of each other. So a similar structure is in effect here, where you have the day-ahead market rules in section 33, and then the real-time market rules in section 29. But here you have a case where not all real-time market participants are also day-ahead market participants. And so what we've tried to do is integrate the real-time market rules and the day-ahead market rules without a complete rewrite or a complete new standalone set of rules for participants in the day-ahead market. And the reason for this is, well, practically speaking, entities can, go into the day-ahead and then within 6 months terminate their participation and revert back to the real-time market only, and things like that. But more importantly, I think, is that there's way more commonality in the rule set for what happens to the day-ahead market participation in the real-time market than there are differences. And so what we've done is in certain places, in primarily section 29.11 and 29.34, so the settlements area and the operations area, the real-time market operations area, we've called out some differences. We've already touched on some of those. EDAM transfers having to be accounted for, and then things like the results of the day-ahead market, and you don't need base schedules because you have day-ahead schedules that set the baseline for the optimizations in the real-time market, and then the settlement is between the differences between the day-ahead market schedules and the real-time results, and that sort of a thing. So we tried to take a light touch, and we think it works, but we're open to discussion on this point because it's kind of structural. So, and specifically here on this section, we tried to add some clarification. I would agree with PacifiCorp that at least as the statement was previously worded, it was a bit confusing. So we've attempted to clarify that here, but let's open that up and see if, all right, we got Chris Jones coming back. Thanks, Chris.
Hey, thanks, John. Yeah, and thanks for the response to this. So just so I'm clear, I think the concern we were raising was the nature of EIM participation changes when you become an EDAM entity, right? We no longer do base schedules. There's, as we mentioned before, there's a change in the sort of rights to participate, not participate in the EIM, that sort of thing. So it sounds like what you're saying is, you've addressed in every situation where an current EIM provision here in section 29 will no longer apply in an EDAM area, and let's just say base scheduling as an example. You've just sort of surgically addressed that in 29, right? And I think that's where you mentioned before the reference to base schedules to change to day-ahead schedule, that sort of thing. So that's basically what you're saying is you've tried to identify every time in 29 where the EIM will not apply in its current form to an EDAM BAA. Is that right?
That is right, Chris. I would add just one more point, and that is that the actual change in the rule is in section 33, but because take the EIM entity under the EIM entity agreement, they're going to sign an addendum to that agreement to make them subject to section 33. So then in section 33, we'll have more precision around, your example that non-participating resources become EDAM resources. And then when you get back to 29, those EDAM resources are all EIM participating resources. So that's circular nature, but exactly what you just said, it's just done a little bit differently. And so in section 29, and I can show you in section 29.34, we have called out those types of changes, every one we could think of, but we didn't go into every reference, say, to EIM participating resource or non-participating resource and add EDAM resources and all of those kind of different things that could be done. But we think it applies by by the way we've structured it here.
Thanks, John.
Okay. And by the way, I really do appreciate the thinking, of these sort of structural questions, because the last thing any of us really want is some sort of a flaw to be discovered, down the road. So I'm going to carry on, and I'm going to go all the way to the end, and then I'll come back to Andrew and Heather for GHG, and then we can do it that way. Okay, so this is again previously the real-time market rules that said that you're not allowed to participate in the day-ahead market, and this, of course, is an exception, and that exception is that unless the participation is enabled within the EIM, BAA, in accordance with 33, then of course participation is also subject to Section 33, and we added some language to reinforce that you have to sign the associated agreement in order to support that participation. So it's not just that the BAA joins EDM, all the other things that go along with Section 33 need to be enforced, including the execution of agreements by the different participants. All right, let's see. Chris, any question on this? I'll just keep moving.
We don't have any questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to zoom past. And like Andrew said, a lot of GHG was to enable that in real time. Okay, so now to carry on with what we were just describing, this is our notation here that also, if the real-time market is within an EDAM area, then you also have to look to Section 33, because there's outcomes produced that either satisfy or modify some of the requirements for EIM market participants. And we've enumerated them here, but again, we've also done that in Section 29.11 for settlements, and we've tried to be sort of an including but not limited to, because there may be something in Section 33 that's not perfectly captured here. So we've done a high level here in a general way at this introductory level. See, I think I may quickly get to RSE, but okay. Yep, no, we're back to the beginning. Okay, so Andrew, do you want me to drive you through 29.32, or do you want to drive your own way through?
I think it's okay if you drive. What I wanted to do was make a couple of just sort of opening comments and structure, and then I don't think it's going to take too long, but I do want to open it up to questions. So we restructured the tariff section 29.32, which are the GHG accounting rules for the Western EIM, and the structure now has parallels with the proposed language in 33.32, and we received some similar comments on the language we posted, and have done our best to kind of tighten it up to make sure we're acknowledging that there are GHG regulation areas and the status of resources in relation to those GHG regulation areas versus, say, a balancing authority area. But again, the concept is the same now as well. And let me restate that the concept will be the same as it is when we promote the extended day-ahead market, in the sense that we'll have two greenhouse gas regulation areas that we'll be modeling versus what we have today, which is a collection of balancing authority areas in the EIM that are within the state of California, within one GHG regulation area. And maybe one way to think about the language in this section is that if you're an EDAM entity, you'll be coming into the real-time market, into the Western Energy Imbalance market, not with a base schedule, but with a day-ahead schedule coming out of the integrated forward market. And that will inform really the volumes for which resources can receive an attribution of a GHG transfer into a GHG regulation area in the real-time market. That day-ahead schedule may include attributions that were awarded in the IFM. Those would continue to be attributable. And then your day-ahead schedule may be less than your upper economic dispatchable limit. So that may provide additional quantities that could receive an attribution in the real-time market. But again, we're re-optimizing, right? And so your attribution in the real-time market may not be the same as it was in the integrated forward market. You may receive less of an attribution, or a resource may receive more of an attribution. So there'd be a deviation settlement. As it pertains to energy imbalance entity BAs and EIM entities, essentially the same holds true today, is that your base schedule will inform the volume that is attributable to your resource to support demand in a greenhouse gas regulation area. Although you'll have two different greenhouse gas regulation areas, so potentially two different bid adders. The other big element is that we will enforce a net export constraint, like we're proposing to do in the integrated forward market, whereby resources within a BA that is a net importer will be eligible to receive an attribution, so the attribution that those resources may be able to receive will only extend up to the net export limit of that balancing authority area. So again, it's another market constraint that we're proposing to utilize to address the potential for secondary dispatch. A couple of nuances that I'd want to point out is that our modeling of greenhouse gas regulation areas in the integrated forward market in the day-ahead time frame is likely, will be, we're pretty confident, different than the greenhouse gas regulation areas we model in the real-time market. And you might say, well, that's insane. Why? The greenhouse gas regulation area is, the state jurisdiction, effectively. But the way we're articulating it in the tariff, it's the pricing nodes within that state jurisdiction. And the pricing nodes that we have in the integrated forward market, certainly on day one of EDAM, will be fewer than we have in the real-time market. There'll be more in the real-time market. So just as a modeling convention, the GHG regulation areas will differ between the two markets. But from a resource-specific perspective, or from a resources point of view, it shouldn't matter, because you'll still be bidding in to offer capacity to serve demand within the greenhouse gas regulation area as it's modeled based on the pricing nodes. And the other point and nuance I maybe want to raise and make sure that it's clear with folks, and I know this was articulated in the policy, and it comes out later, I think, in tariff language in our Appendix C of the tariff, is a formulation of locational marginal prices. In our current real-time market in the Western EIM, the greenhouse gas component, or marginal cost component of LMP, is treated as a negative component of LMP, and that's changing as we promote the extended day-ahead market, and it will change for the Western Energy Imbalance market too, whereby it'll be, it will no longer be a negative component. It will be essentially a positive element, a separate payment. But again, the payment will reflect the megawatt quantities multiplied by the marginal GHG cost of the GHG regulation area for which the resource receives an attribution for a GHG transfer. So again, as we talked about this morning, a resource potentially could receive a GHG marginal payment for serving demand in the state of Washington, for serving demand in the state of California in the same real-time market interval. And all of that information would obviously be provided to the resources scheduling coordinator through our market results interface. Let me stop there, sort of a mouthful, and see if there are any foundational questions that folks may have.
We are not seeing any questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, well then maybe what I would do is I don't think we need to go through each and every subsection of section 2932, but I would encourage folks to read it in conjunction with reading section 33.32, because our goal is to achieve some symmetry and the same rules with respect to which resources are submitting bids, which resources are not submitting bids, should play out through those two different sections, and how we're affecting the attribution of GHG transfers to resources based on their bid adders, and calculating both the resources maximum GHG bid adder for a day, and also how we're calculating payments should all flow through and run in parallel. But again, importantly, the real-time, will be a deviation from the IFM, so there will be a deviation settlement. Even though you have an attribution in the IFM, your attribution may be less in the real time, and vice versa, it may be more as well. But again, always based on your bid adders.
Okay. Well,
Thanks, John.
like a lot of these comments run in parallel to the changes that were made and that were covered under the day-ahead market GHG.
Yeah, no, and again, thanks both to PacifiCorp and WPTF for calling out some of these provisions. It's helpful.
Okay. Oh, and now I've done it to myself. Okay, Heather, we're going to go with the RSC, and again, I'll offer to drive if you would like, but in
why don't I just take over the screen share? I think I can run through it quickly. This section, as commenters noted, and as we appreciate, 29 is not structured for quite as ease of navigation, and we apologize for that, but we're working with what we have. So 29.34K is where we will begin our RSE section. As we previewed on the EDAM section, there's really going to be minimal changes, though there may be room for further development. We didn't get comments here, so again, the edits you see will probably be mostly mine on some edit, just cleaning up and clarifying. But folks should take a second look at these sections if they haven't already. Okay, so there will be no changes to the balancing test in subsection K, and no changes for the capacity test in subsection L, which brings us to the flex test in subsection M. So if you are an individual EIM balancing authority area, so this means either you have not joined the EDAM or you have been excluded from the EDAM pools, you will be covered here. There are no changes. this little subsection change is just because we'd inserted some provisions in the middle. I'm going to note that we do need to do a final cleanup of our subsection changes, but the intent is to keep it exactly the same. So if you're not in the EDAM, you should see no changes. If the CAISO balancing authority is excluded from the pool, it'll continue to be evaluated in the same way it is today. This blue highlighting here reflects some changes we have pending before FERC on the RSE Phase 2 initiative. If those are accepted, this blue highlighting will go away. But again, no change over status quo for CAISO BAA. And so here we clarify again what we've already said in the EDAM tariff. Pursuant to 3331.14, balancing authorities in the EDAM area will only be evaluated pursuant to this subsection for the flex test. It's a little about, what we will consider when you're in the EDAM, again, just kind of flowing through the framework. And then it provides, sorry, I scrolled one too far. The CAISO will evaluate both the upward and downward EDAM pools to ensure they have sufficient bids and ramping capability to meet the uncertainty requirements within a tolerance band. And again, just clarifying, if you're not included in the pool, you're evaluated as an individual. So again, we've memorialized treating the EDAM pools as a super BAA for purposes of the flex test. Again, just clarifying a bit on the diversity benefits. This just flows through directly what was in the policy paper. Again, we're not making any changes here for diversity benefits for entities that are not in the EDAM area, but we're clarifying the language so that there's no confusion. Let's see. And then again, diversity benefits for the pool. So I think you guys, again, those are straight through the policy paper. I don't think there's much to do there. If, again, we're seeing some changes from the RSE Phase 2, I just need to get to the next section. Okay, so we're now going to, if the pool has failed the RSE test in the WEAM, in the RSE Phase 2 initiative, we developed an assistance transfer product. And so in this subsection here, which is what I would call out for folks just to take a look at, because we do have a few places that could use a bit of further development. In this section here, this is setting up a structure of if the pool entities are taking assistance energy transfers or not taking assistance energy transfers. So as we describe here, if you're part of the pool, you may still elect to receive assistance energy transfers. That's an individual election. If the entities that are pooled together have a uniform election, then that is easy. This sentence is for if the pooled entities do not have a uniform election. In that case, they're going to be subdivided into two subpools, a subpool that has elected to receive assistance energy and a subpool that has not elected to receive assistance energy. If the subpool that has elected to receive the assistance energy, then not subject to the failure consequences, meaning the members of the pool will not have their transfers locked, and again, we'll pay the surcharge for the assistance energy transfer surcharge. The part that we had probably could use some room for further development is right here. If you are part of the subpool or pool of EDAM BAA entities and the pool has taken assistance energy, there are revenue and surcharges associated with that. At the moment, we have put in that they will be allocated pro rata to members of the pool or subpool as applicable. We are open to further refinement and suggestions. We didn't receive any comments in the first round, but I understand there's a lot to review here. But to the extent folks have alternative allocation methodologies, we're happy to chat more and reflect those here to the extent necessary. And so with that, John, that is the end of my EIM RSE section. Like I said, it's pretty simple. For the pool, you know, we're evaluating as a super BAA, and we use some edits to distinguish between the individual EIM entity and then the pooled entities. All entities in the EDAM are only evaluated for the flex test. And then where it gets a little complicated is when we get into the assistance energy transfers, the splitting in the subpools, and then the revenue and surcharge allocation amongst the members of those subpools. So happy to have further discussions on this at this time or in the future. But John, I think it looks like we have no hands, no chat. So I think I'm going to turn it over to you, back to you, if anything else here in section 29.
No, I think that wraps up section 29, you know, for today anyway. I think we're going to shift gears now. We're going to go into section 33.11. So settlements, here we go. 2 o'clock on a Friday. We're going to get in an hour of settlements. We probably won't, but we may get to section 11. But we do have Monday available for that as well. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. Let's see. Okay. Yeah. And so, again, 33.11. So, settlements for EDAM market participants. Now, we're going to start, in the first 2 sections we'll cover are the transfer and congestion revenue allocations for these day-ahead market participants. And then I'm going to pass it over back to probably Heather for the RSE settlement that she talked about. And I'm hoping we can get through the transfer and congestion revenue by about 2:30. I do need to leave at that time, so this will work out well, assuming things go smoothly for us here. All right, so there were some folks, and I didn't mean to call up Pacificorp specifically, but some folks said, you know, there's a lot of material, settlements is complicated, we're still reviewing it. So we appreciate that. We understand that. We look forward to your further consideration. Hopefully our publication of these incremental red lines is helpful, gives you a bit of a head start on the publication of the second draft of the tariff. So when the second draft comes out, you'll have already seen, you know, a little bit, to the extent you're interested in incremental changes, and can, you know, drill in further and provide us your additional feedback on round 2. But for round 1, with where we are, and we did receive a number of comments, and we've done our best here to address those, and we'll go through those. So orient folks back again. We're back in the day-ahead market, and now we have this construct where we have transfers between EDAM BAAs, and we need to account for the transfer revenues and congestion revenues that are associated with the settlement at those transfer locations. So 2 different concepts. This was discussed at length in the proposal, and the first is the transfer revenue concept. And here, essentially, what we have are these transfer system resources that represent the transfer between the BAAs, and they are priced. Those system resources are priced specifically for this purpose, and those prices can be different, and that difference in prices results in transfer revenue being collected, and then that transfer revenue is allocated to the EDAM BAAs, and it's done for each of these different products: energy, imbalance reserves, and reliability capacity, because each one of those will have a separate pricing component and a separate transfer, I guess, limit or system resource associated with those. So the first comment we received was about the calculation and allocation of these revenues. So we've made a number of incremental changes in these sections. And again, we're back where these changes you're seeing are incremental to what was in the published version. And so here we have transfer revenues, and we have energy first, then we have the provisions for imbalance reserves and reliability capacity. They all now parallel each other, or we've attempted to. Previously, we had not been clear that imbalance transfer revenue or reliability capacity transfer revenue was eligible for settlement with legacy contract rights holders, and we have clarified that in this version here. So around these commercial arrangements, we've tried to provide some additional details here. There was a comment that, look, you can't just defer to the business practice manual for how these arrangements are understood. And so we've added language here in the tariff to say these are unique and specific sharing arrangements, and they must have been documented in an agreement between the BAAs at the respective transfer locations. And so that can affect the allocations of these locations. But again, these are not just sudden new arrangements, but we are aware that there are some unique circumstances, and this will allow us to account for that in those circumstances. Again, we've added some cross-references to Pathway 2 to clarify that all these different Pathway 2, which is the making your transmission capability available for optimization before the day at market. Those are all eligible for transfer revenue, and all of them are eligible for all three flavors of transfer revenues. So we have made those changes. Look at this comment here. So then we do have a question or comment that this is the sub-allocation. In other words, so now we have two concepts. First is the entity, and then is the CAISO. So in essence, the transfer revenue, once it's divided between the BAAs, then it is sub-allocated according, and in this case, for the entity BAA, it is according to the EDAM transmission service provider tariff. The previous provision had some language around their business practices to adjust costs among transmission customers, and there's competing interests here. We got comments that sought more definition and specificity about how an EDAM transmission service provider could allocate these transfer revenues. And then we got other comments that said that no, this is a matter that should be reserved to the transmission service provider tariff. So this is occurring in the CAISO BAA specific rules. And so we're familiar with these cost allocation issues, and that it's really a matter between the BAA and the customers. And so similar to what's happening in the CAISO, we would anticipate that would occur when the EDAM entity or the transmission service provider amends its tariff to participate in the EDAM, and we've referred or deferred to those rules for this determination. And again, like I mentioned, this transfer revenue that is allocated to the ISO is simply further allocated, and for now, all we say is according to the CAISO tariff. There is an expectation that there would be a rule for allocating these transfer revenues among CAISO market participants within the CAISO BAA, and then that would occur under the CAISO tariff but that is it is a to be determined matter at this point. So again, for imbalance reserves, yeah, go ahead.
It looks like you have a hand raised.
Okay, I'm not seeing hands. I'll take that.
Hi, John. Doug Boccignone for the Bay Area Municipal Transmission Group. Thanks for making some of the clarifying edits that we requested. I had a question on that final sentence of that section that you were just in. We had suggested also cross-referencing to 33.18.3, just to kind of link those sections together.
So, well, here, you mean, are you suggesting that that would be the reference for the agreement, or are you suggesting something different?
I think in that section is where you also talk about the agreement, and it seems like they're sort of naturally linked together. So we had suggested saying consistent with section 33.18.3 and the terms. And then we had a way back at the very top, sort of a clarifying question, and it's maybe a George question, but you know, the section starts off at the same section that the transfer revenue occurs when the net EDAM transfer scheduling limit is reached in the day-ahead market. And one of the things that occurred to us is I think this is meant to mean, the net, between any two BAAs, it's all these interfaces where the transmission's been contributed and is part of that EDAM transfer limit. But it seems like there could be instances where, due to internal transmission constraints within the BAA, not all of those interties could actually support transfers. You could have constraints internal that means, injecting more within the BAA from a generator doesn't mean you're going to get transfers, distributed across the available capacity. And I don't recall having discussions about this in the policy, but it just seemed like if that could happen, where you're not actually able to deliver on the transfers, you could get a kind of a strange result. And this just sort of generically describes net EDAM transfer scheduling limit without much description.
Yeah, I will ask for some help from George, but I mean, I think what you're describing is we've captured with the separation of the congestion revenue from the transfer revenue. So the transfer revenue has to be the result of price differences in these EDAM transfer system resources, which are used to model the scheduling limits at those locations. And it's only based on the differences between those transfer system resources that you get transfer revenue. So if the congestion is internal to a BAA and you can't reach that location, then that would be captured as congestion revenue. But I'll ask for George or James, whoever's first, go for it.
Okay, George with the ESO. And you do have the combination of physical constraints and scheduling constraints enforced in the market. And scheduling constraints are always on interties. Now, the scheduled flow on a specific intertie, which is transfer, is not really limited by physical flow constraints, meaning that 1,000 megawatt transmission capacity on an intertie potentially you may not be able to have 1,000 megawatt physical power flow that intertie because of internal physical congestion that would limit the flow. But you could have 1,000 megawatts scheduled because that is not constrained by physical constraints, either at the intertie or further inside the BAA. So it's the nature of the difference between what is a schedule and what's a physical flow. So even though the physical flow may not be potentially actually scheduled because of physical constraints, the schedule still can be feasible with the scheduling limit. And having 1,000 megawatt schedule on an intertie, that doesn't mean that you actually have 1,000 megawatt of flow. You could have the schedule physically being transmitted through other parallel transmission paths. So I don't see that there is a tight interaction between those two. And the fact that we enforce both of these constraints, both physical and schedule limits, guarantee that you have a feasible outcome of how the transmission is used. So you could have schedules subject to scheduling limits and how much transmission capacity is released between BAAs without overloading transmission lines and transmission facilities, because we also enforce the physical limits. I don't know how else to address that.
No, yeah, I understand that, George. I guess I was thinking sort of a slightly different situation where there's multiple interties between the two BAAs, and one of them can accommodate the scheduled energy, and it's the physical constraint is respected, and then you have another that there's just you inject more energy in the BAA, but it's not going to get to that other intertie. And so I guess in that situation, do you just say I can schedule more energy transfers even though it just can't happen? You just give credit for those transfers?
Yeah, you can, because if you add up all the schedules on all interties, you get what we call the net scheduled interchange. That quantity on net is becoming a physical quantity. So your net scheduled interchange may not flow actually on each intertie based on the schedule of that intertie, but the total energy from all interties will find its way in the transmission grid to go from that source BAA to that sink BAA. It's just that the actual flows of that traveling from one BAA to another does not align on the specific intertie with the actual flow of that intertie. But on net, it does happen. It does transfer.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I wonder if it would just, I don't think there's anywhere where there's like a defined term of the net EDAM transfer scheduling limit. I wonder if you.
Oh, we use that a lot. There must be. I will defer to John on that. I remember we did define that because we were using it a lot.
Yeah, I remember the discussions of it. I'm thinking in the
We define this, but I'm not sure we've defined what this term.
Yeah, the net
of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, we just say this, and that's what it means, what George said. So I do not have I would have used the defined term here if we had one, so we don't have one. So we say net EDAM transfer scheduling limit.
I think it might be helpful, or at least I suggest considering creating one.
Yeah, we have constraints that they limit the net EDAM transfer. I'm not using it as a term, small small n, like, the net export constraint limits the net transfer, or in real time, if a BAA is not receiving assistance energy and it's failing the RSC and we isolate it, basically we put a net transfer constraint on it. So it's used in several instances.
Right.
Since, yeah.
But just generally, we don't, but the net value, we don't always define net. We just use net as a modification of an existing defined term. So we'll think about it, Doug. Are you ready to move on here? I think we need to.
Yeah, I'm fine. Thanks. I appreciate it.
Okay. So these other sections, imbalance reserve, and reliability capacity transfer, these are slightly modified to reflect all of the changes that I described up above, including the addition of the allocations to the legacy contracts or ownership rights holders and the like, and all those additional clarifications. So you'll see all of those changes here. I'm not going to go through them all again. And, that's the sum total of the transfer revenue collection and allocation that we have here in section 33. There's a real-time component to this in the offsets, and we'll get to that when we get to section 11. But before I shift to congestion revenue, just let's take a quick pause and see if there's any other questions on transfer revenues.
I don't see any questions in queue.
Okay. So congestion revenue. So for day ahead, congestion revenue within the EDAM area, we have formulated a fairly high-level description of how the congestion revenue is calculated, and then how it is distributed among the different BAAs. And then once distributed, it is then adjusted. Well, sorry, this adjustment includes the ownership rights or legacy contracts and ETC-like treatments. We call it the adjustments. In other words, the zeroing out of the congestion that might be associated with that. And all that revenue then goes to the BAA, and then the EDAM entity, and similar to transmission or transfer revenue, it is the EDAM transmission service providers that receive the further allocation of that, and that is in accordance with the transmission service provider tariff and business practices. And then similar to that, for the CAISO BAA, we have a mechanism existing already to allocate congestion revenues, and we have that in the ISO tariff, so we included a cross-section reference, and so that's to address one of the stakeholder comments we received from BAMX. So that is where we've attempted to clarify this point. I see Doug just raised his hand, and let me check this comment. So this is the same comment I described above, where there's a tension between some stakeholders seeking more specificity and others seeking less specificity. And we, similar to transfer revenue, we, the ISO, has decided that we should defer to the transmission service provider and their tariffs for these allocations. Doug, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Thanks, John. So the tariff sections you referenced there, 11.2.1 and 11.2.4, I think those sort of talk about how sort of the perfect hedge treatment for people who are using their rights. But I think they don't necessarily cover things like you know, if like the CRR exchange agreements that exist for the COT transmission and the Pacific Corp transmission. And I just...
So those would be covered by those agreements, right? It's according to the CAISO tariff. So help me out here, Doug. So well, I'm familiar with the agreements, and they receive CRRs in exchange for transmission capacity. So those CRRs are treated in accordance with the CAISO tariff. So whoever holds that CRR would be settled according to the CAISO tariff and that agreement. They would receive that revenue.
Okay, so the reference, okay, so referring to sections 11.2.1 and 11.2.4 is not exclusively the only sections, it's the other parts of the tariff. But,
okay. We just didn't want to repeat all of this up here. The adjustments, those are accomplished here. So the congestion revenue adjustments, the allocation is according to the CAISO tariff, and any
I get it. After taking into consideration all the adjustments. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Okay.
I get it.
Yeah, I know it's not always that straightforward, Doug. Everyone else, it's helping us through these things. Okay. Thanks. So Heather, perfect timing, right on the moment, 2:30. My scheduled departure time. I appreciate everyone's time, and you know, we'll pick this up again Monday. I suspect we'll probably make it through 3311, not 11 today if we get there. Someone can carry on with other things, but we'll probably pick up with section 11 and the balance of the materials on Monday. Heather, I'm going to stop sharing. You can. Oh, all right, perfect.
I got it. You're good, John. Thank you so much for leading us today. We will catch up with you and appreciate everything.
Yep, okay, so everybody's doing great. Thank you.
So we have about a half an hour left. I'm sure people are exhausted. This is going to, you know, require some focus. So I apologize. We received some overall comments that some things in the definition should be in the tariff. I'm going to say overall, I believe all major provisions are in the tariff. We have used definitions as a key component here of the RSE surcharge. I'm going to walk through it with you all, and I've created a separate document that I'll flip over to share that has the definitions excerpted. We are happy to consider including them more in the tariff, but as you'll see, I think I've set up the tariff with hopefully a clarity that we may lose if we try to incorporate too much of that in here. But let's walk through and see how it goes. I'm just cleaning up some language here. Again, we didn't receive too many comments on this section, so most of these are my edits and cleanups. So, you know, just clean up some language. There was some confusion and it really wasn't worded right. I think everyone understood what we were getting at. This does raise, I guess now might be a good time to talk about the de minimis exception to the downward RSE failure surcharge that we previewed earlier. Milos, Danny, did you guys just want to briefly touch on that? I think while we're happy to, earlier on this call, I referred folks to the portion of the final proposal that had the discussion on this charge. But then since that time, I think the CAISO team has also been having some discussions. So Milos, or Danny, whoever wants to take it, why don't I turn it over to one of you guys, and then you guys can lead any discussions on the de minimis exception.
Yeah, thanks, Heather. This is Milos. Good afternoon, everybody. And then Danny, feel free to jump in. Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we're going to consider internally. I think we're leaning towards including the similar de minimis exception that's in the upward direction to create that symmetry between the downward surcharge and the upward surcharge. I think throughout the design, there was recognition overall that some small amount of failures are recognized that they're going to happen, especially as we have all load and all resources are now participating. And so there was that general recognition of acknowledging a small de minimis exception that was captured in the upward direction, but we think also it makes sense to extend that and apply it in the downward direction as well. So I think, subject to any concerns from folks, I think we would expect then in the next iteration to see something along those lines reflected in this language to include that same tier 1 structure to the exception, to the de minimis exception in the downward direction as well. But Danny, I don't know if you want to add anything to that as well.
No, I think that captures it, Milos. I was just going to ask everybody in their comments to kind of state if this is something that would be amenable to you. So we have that information in revising the next iteration of the tariff. Thanks.
Okay, well, that sounds good. Alva, I see you have your hand up, so if we could unmute Alva, and we'll see if we want to facilitate some discussion. I think what you just heard from Milos and Danny is a commitment that, yep, go ahead, Alva.
Okay, no, I'm always appreciate the CAISO being so responsive, and I agree with this direction, I think, but I was really trying to understand better. I mean, Danny had alluded to the idea that the downward costs were going to be sort of nominal anyway, and I was really interested in just understanding the argument of the arbitrage, because somebody had that idea, and I'd like to understand it, even if I think I'm right. You know, I was just trying to sort of understand how what the CAISO is thinking, what was on this previously. So if there's any way to explain that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, Alva. I'd hope some. Oh, go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. It's not so much arbitrage in my mind. It's just a reliance on the rest of the EDAM to relieve a lack of downward flexibility, and that's what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to create an incentive for BAAs to submit sufficient downward flexibility bids on their resources.
Okay, I agree with that direction. I think that would not be an argument against a de minimis exception, though, because I think there's the same thing in the upward direction. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Danny.
Sure, Alva.
And I was just going to point folks to, I think page 74 of the final proposal is where it's discussed. I was thinking we might have more discussion here, but since we have a more compressed time, I think our path forward is, we're happy to, of course, talk with folks, but I think we're going to put out a proposal in our next draft that will include a de minimis exception unless there's any opposition to that. And again, folks can take time to review page 74, and if there's opposition to such, definitely try to funnel that back to us.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Alva, for raising it before and now. So, okay, so to the calculation of the surcharge. First surcharge, EDAM RSE on peak, upward failure insufficiency surcharge. Okay, this is applied when a BAA in the EDAM area fails to satisfy all of the upward components of the EDAM RSE. And again, I'm just kind of cleaning up some language here. But they fail to satisfy those components during any hour within the 16-hour on-peak period. That receives an assessment of this charge, the upward failure insufficiency surcharge, in each of the 16-hour on-peak period. As we talked earlier, there is the tiered structure, which we describe in tiers in that language in 33.31.1.5. This calculation language I'm about to walk you through, it includes those tiers. So on peak, upward failure insufficiency surcharge calculated as the product of highest EDAM RSE hourly upward deficiency quantity during that 16-hour block times the greater of the published bilateral electric prices for the applicable EDAM trade location and the EDAM RSE failure multiplier adjusted by the EDAM RSE failure scaling factor. And then it will also be for each hour in which the entity passed the RSE, there will be a credit, which is the EDAM RSE on peak upward credit. Excuse me for a second. Sorry about that. So I just want to walk through. So we could, instead of using these definitions, we could put a bunch more detail here, but let's walk through the definitions. So the highest of the EDAM RSE hourly upward deficiency quantity. If I'm going to do this right, I'm going to be able to flip over to another document. And I'm going to be able to make it a little bigger here. Okay. So that is, and this is just an excerpt from Appendix A that you guys have seen, but I just put it into a nicer looking form for us. So it's the first one here, which is the megawatt sum total of the upward failures during any single operating hour, inclusive of the deficiency in the demand component, the imbalance reserve component, and the ancillary service component. So it's the megawatt sum total. And again, I think it's cleaner to handle that through a definition. So it's the highest of during the 16-hour on-peak period times the greater of the published bilateral electric index price for the actual EDAM trade location. So the bilateral electric index price was in the policy paper, and the policy paper discussed using mid-C and PV, though we understand people would like to consider using others in the future. And so if we flip over to our definitions for EDAM trade location, we see that that's a major bilateral trading hub, essentially with sufficient liquidity. As identified in the BPM, we intend the BPM to list PV and mid-C on initial release. And then, and now I'll get to you, I promise. And then we have the EDAM RSE failure multiplier adjusted by the EDAM RSE failure scaling factor. The failure multiplier applies to the tiers. The policy paper discussed that it scales up. So once you're above tier, tier 1 is 0. Tier above that, if you're a tier 2 failure, your multiplier is a 1.25. And if you're a tier 3 failure, your multiplier is 2. And just to be clear, we have it here in the definition, we have it in the tariff. It's subject to the failure multiplier. I have the term wrong. It should be the EDAM RSE failure scaling factor, which is an adder calculated on a rolling basis to account for the hours of persistent failure over the preceding 30 days. And what this does is it adds 1% to the failure multiplier for every additional day during the preceding 30-day period where there was a tier 2 or 3 failure. That was a lot of information. I'm sure there's a lot to digest, but Alva had his hand up. So why don't we unmute Alva and go from there?
Hi, thank you, Heather. Just a quick question about what are the guarantees? And you may be using this kind of surcharge elsewhere in the tariffs. I just don't know how do you avoid any potential manipulation of the index by participants who may be subject to it after, once they realize that they're going to be subject to it. I don't exactly know is it a question of the timing, or is it provable that they can't influence that value?
So I'm going to repeat your question back to make sure I understand it. Is your question, so we have this structure, and one component of the structure is the published bilateral electric index price. And is your question, how do we know folks aren't influencing that price?
In order to reduce the surcharge, or increase it for that matter.
Oh, yeah, right, to affect it in some way.
Yeah.
I'm going to say that's a new question to me. I totally understand the question. So I'm going to say, CAISO folks on the line, to whoever wants to speak up, have we had a chance to consider that? If not, I think we can add it to our list. If we have, if someone could chime in with a response, that would be great.
Yeah, Heather, this is Danny. So Alva, I would kind of classify that as tangential to a discussion we had in the policymaking process and deciding to use the bilateral hub. I think where we landed is that, at least for Go Live, it's our best idea, and we would monitor it to make sure that it's sufficiently not being manipulated.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, but I think as folks review, if there's other protections or other revisions we should make to address that issue, please get them to us in comments. I think we do want to make sure that folks aren't able to, you know, influence the surcharge in some way that is unfair and improper. So I'm happy to take further comment on that.
Appreciate that.
Okay, is it Louisa Lund? Is that? I think you're up next. If I said your name right.
Hi, this is Louisa Lund from Daymark Energy Advisors. I just have a small clarification question. In your definitions, you said that for tier 1, the multiplier is 0. Do you mean that you multiply the penalty by 0, so the penalty itself is 0, or do you really mean 1?
We mean this component. Oh, sorry. For some reason we have an echo. We mean this component. So the EDAM RSE failure multiplier, just that component. Oh, you're right. It would 0 out. Okay. We will fix that because you're right. Since it's a product, it would put the entire equation at 0. Thank you, Louisa. I'm just going to flip over here. Actually, that's going to be too complicated. I'm going to take a note on paper. Thank you so much. That was not the intent. It's to reflect that, of course, there's no failure multiplier for a tier 1 charge. So let me work on that. I think everyone understands in theory. Okay, Todd Ryan at PG&E.
Hi, Todd Ryan at PG&E. Yes, I would just to follow up on Alva's comment. I believe in the policy process, like Danny mentioned, that we had talked about maybe some kind of backstop in case the bilateral hubs weren't representative of the liquid price. And so my suggestion may be to have some kind of tariff language to that effect that gives the CAISO the authority to put in a proxy price where appropriate.
Thank you, Todd. That sounds good. And I will just, you know, in the definition of EDAM trade location, we do have where there is sufficient liquidity in the definition. So I think it's great point on the backstop authority to the extent that any of the points at any time does not have that sufficient liquidity. So I don't know exactly what we're going to propose, but I have a note here to develop that and include.
Yeah, I mean, there might be a case where none of the hubs are sufficiently liquid.
Yep, absolutely makes sense. So we'll get back to the team on what that will be, but thank you so much. Okay, Todd, anything else on yours, or is your hand down now? Perfect. Okay, so we walked through the charge, and I should have walked through the credit. I apologize for missing the credit here. The on-peak upward credit this is for the hours in which you pass, and it's the product of, so the credit is the product of the highest EDAM RSE upward deficiency quantity of the day, so not just during the 16-hour period, but of the day, and the load weighted average LMP of the LAP within the BAA. So hearing that, if anyone on the call would like to weigh in on whether we should keep these defined terms, or if folks really would like to see all of that detail of the defined terms baked here into the tariff, happy to talk about that now, happy to take written comment on that. But otherwise, I think we'll just spend our last 13 minutes going through the off-peak surcharge and the downward. Okay. So the kind of one comment we got here, and I think it's probably on the on-peak too, is just to clarify the time zone we are talking about here. And these are, it's a challenging proposition, and it's hard because the time zones can be different in different places for different purposes. We've made the decision that it's going to be, everything is referenced in Pacific time for our charges. The CAISO does not have a defined term for an on-peak and an off-peak period, and it is used in a variety of places throughout the tariff in different ways. Within each of the charge definitions, we have specified the hours. We can also add the hours here in the tariff if folks don't think that is sufficient. The challenging thing is we do not want to create a defined term for an off-peak period. So if folks could just keep that in mind as they review. But the off-peak upward failure insufficiency surcharge is the product of the EDAM RSE hourly upward deficiency quantity, the load weighted average LMP of the LAC within the BAA, and the EDAM RSE failure multiplier. So again, the hourly deficiency quantity will be the deficiency in the hour for each of the three components. Obviously, folks know what the LMP is. And the EDAM RSE failure multiplier is the tier factor, which again, thanks to Louisa for pointing out the math error, but tier 1 has no failure multiplier. Tier 2, and now, sorry, too many things going on at once. There it is. Okay, let's see. Tier 2 failure is a 1.25 multiplier, and a tier 3 failure is a multiplier of 2. Any questions on the off-peak surcharge or any discussion? Okay, downward. Again, we got lots of comments on the de minimis exception, and I think we've addressed that now. So downward charge is much easier. The hourly downward deficiency quantity, so the three components deficiencies added together, and the marginal energy cost of that balancing authority. So this is a much lower charge. This charge is only occur, during the hour. And so, keep that in mind as folks review the proposal for the de minimis exception, is that the downward charge is a much lower charge and then the other charges that we just went through. Okay, any question on calculation? Okay. Seeing none, we really didn't get any comments on the distribution methodologies here. My edits here are really for clarification and administrative. Rather than saying passed the RSE, we're going to say satisfied all of the upward components, things like that. Idaho Power had a comment on our backup allocation, and we've taken that comment such that if there's no balancing authority in the EDAM area that satisfied all upward components of the RSE in any single hour, then rather than doing some sort of collection and redistribution to a set of entities, the CAISO will just not collect that surcharge in that hour. So essentially, refunding it to those who paid it rather than distributing it out to a different set of entities. Any comments or questions on a change to the backup allocation? Okay. Same thing here for the distribution of the failure in off-peak insufficiency surcharge. And again, just Idaho Power, we took that comment and made the same change here. And then the downward distribution, no changes. All of these are just cleanups to not say past the RSE. Again, and then the allocations are to the BAA, and so the scheduling coordinator for the EDAM entity receives the revenue and the costs. Those revenue and costs are apportioned in accordance with the requirements for the EDAM entity of their applicable tariffs and business practices. And of course, to the CAISO for suballocation in accordance with the CAISO tariff. And so with that leaves us with 7 minutes. I am happy to take any questions on settlements on the EDAM RSE. I think the CAISO team hopefully agrees with me that we don't want to enter a new topic since our meeting here is scheduled to end at 3. And so if there are no questions, Andrew, are you still on the line? And can I turn the mic and control back over to you?
I am here, and you may. Hi, everyone. So Heather took us up to day-ahead market settlements, which is as good a stopping place as any, especially because we have 7 minutes left. And I think what we will do is reconvene on Monday and make our way to the remainder of Section 3311, and then tackle the other sections of the tariff and the appendices. Pretty confident we'll get through them on Monday. Actually, I'm very confident we will. And I think what we'll be doing is, I think we signaled this in the market notice we issued recently, that we would make these working draft red lines available to stakeholders to look at. We're not doing so for the purpose of soliciting comments on them, in so much as more making sure that you have material and are able to review and not have to wait until the beginning of June to see a new holistic set of red lines. You'll see them then, but we want to make sure you've got some material to look at and use the time as efficiently as possible. But that's still our working plan, which is during the first full week of June to get a revised draft tariff language posted to the stakeholder community. So with that, I'll turn it back to Brenda and say thank you very, very much for all your time, especially on a Friday.
Thank you, Andrew, for your closing remarks for today. Thank you to all our subject matter experts and the legal teams and staff to have participated in this workshop. As we were mentioning, we are going to have our other workshop on Monday, so feel free to see those information to log in for that WebEx meeting. This is the policy initiative stakeholder process that I wanted to go quickly over. So we have received approval. One second. Can I get control over the slides? Thank you. So for the joint approval received was on February 1st, 2023, and we're also targeting the Q2 2023 tariff filing. We're also going to target the system development for implementation for fall 2024, and also go live and onboarding for spring 2025. So more information will be discussed maybe later on within the release user group and other groups that we have within the ISO, but this is the main policy initiative timeline that we would like to communicate. And lastly, we wanted to go ahead and just inform that the huge next steps will be that in early June, we will be posting the revised draft tariff language, as well the tariff filing that comes along with that. And so stay tuned for that daily briefing that will be updated through a notice during the time that it's posted. As well, there's an energy blog that we just posted for the summer outlook for the summer loads and resources assessment. And this was just posted this past week. Feel free to visit the blog, as well as the link that will guide you to all the assessments that we did for the upcoming conditions in California and other loads. So it's a great article, and we do post monthly. So thanks, everyone. And I would like to give you guys all a happy Friday and stay safe. And thank you to my event producer, Silas. We can go ahead and conclude our meeting.
That concludes today's conference. Thank you for using event services, and you may now disconnect.